What does it mean to truly listen to the night? Not the night as we know it now, softened by street lamps and distant traffic, but the night as it once was, a vast, breathing presence that pressed against thin cabin walls and made every shadow feel like a question waiting for an answer. Tonight, we're drifting back to a time when winter nights stretched across the frontier like dark water, when the hours between sunset and dawn felt longer than entire days, and when settlers learned that the most profound kind of fear doesn't always announce itself with violence or chaos. Sometimes it simply waits just beyond the edge of firelight, patient and inevitable as the cold itself. Before we step into this quiet journey through winter's grip on early frontier settlements, I'd like to ask a small favor. If you're settling in for this passage into history's darker corners, please tap the like button and subscribe to Epic Boring History. It helps us continue these late-night explorations together. Leave a comment too if you'd like. Tell me where you are right now, what time it is in your world, whether you're watching as night deepens or as morning slowly arrives. Now, perhaps, dim your lights. Maybe let a fan hum softly in the background, creating that steady, soothing white noise that helps the mind drift. Let's begin our journey into those long winter nights, when wolves came close enough to be heard. You measure your safety in daylight hours, and winter is a season of diminishing returns. By late December, the sun begins its descent around 4 in the afternoon, sometimes earlier when heavy clouds settle low over the forest, and you feel time accelerating toward that moment when work must stop, not because tasks are finished, but because darkness changes the rules of everything you do. The light doesn't vanish all at once. It drains slowly from the sky, turning first to pewter, then to something deeper and more ambiguous, a blue-gray that makes the snow-covered clearing around your cabin seem to glow faintly while the tree line grows darker, denser, somehow taller than it appeared at midday. You're bringing in the last of the firewood now, your breath visible in short clouds that dissipate almost instantly in the cold air. Your hands are already stiff inside worn gloves, and the wood you're stacking against the cabin wall feels almost warm compared to the iron-hard cold of the axe handle you were gripping an hour ago. The forest stands perhaps 50 yards from your door, closer in some places where you haven't yet cleared the stumps and undergrowth. At this hour, just before full darkness, those trees seem to lean inward slightly, their bare branches creating a complicated latticework against the dimming sky. You pause for a moment, arms full of split logs, and you listen. This is becoming a habit now, this stopping to listen as daylight fades, though you're not entirely sure when it started or why you feel compelled to do it. The wind moves through the upper branches with a sound like distant conversation, words you can almost but never quite make out. Snow shifts somewhere in the forest, a clump falling from an overladen branch, you tell yourself, though the sound carries differently than it should, seems to travel along the ground rather than falling from above. Your dog, a lean mixed breed whose ribs show despite regular feeding, has already positioned himself near the cabin door. He's not barking, not whining, but his ears are forward, and his attention is fixed on something in the middle distance, some point between the cabin and the trees where the clearing darkens first. You stamp your boots against the threshold, knocking off packed snow, and push your way inside. The door is solid timber, thicker than it needs to be for weather alone, hung on iron hinges that your neighbor helped you install last autumn, when the first hard frost came and everyone on this stretch of frontier land seemed to remember, all at once, that winter was coming. Inside, the cabin is already dim. Your wife has lit one lantern, just one, because oil must be conserved, rationed across the long months when supply wagons cannot reach the settlement, and it casts more shadow than light, creating small pools of visibility that make the corners of the room feel distant, separate, like small territories beyond the lantern's jurisdiction. The smell is what you notice first every time you enter after being outside. Smoke from the hearth which never quite vents properly, despite your efforts to improve the chimney draught. Damp wool hanging near the fire to dry, giving off a thick animal scent. Stored food, root vegetables in their barrel, salted meat wrapped in cloth, the faint sweetness of dried apples hanging in a string near the rafters. The cabin measures perhaps 16 feet by 20, a single room that serves as kitchen, workshop, sleeping quarters, and the entire domestic world for your family through these frozen months. The ceiling is low enough that you can touch the beams without stretching, and the walls are chinked with mud and moss that you'll need to replace again come spring because the winter contraction and expansion of the logs works the chinking loose, creates small gaps where cold air flows through like water finding cracks in stone. Your wife is moving between the hearth and the table, preparing the evening meal, and she doesn't look up when you enter. She doesn't need to. She heard your boots on the threshold, recognized the particular rhythm of your movements, the sound of wood being stacked outside before you came in. Your children, 2 boys, 7 and 9, are already seated on the bench near the table, their hands folded in their laps. They're quieter than they were in summer, quieter than they'll be again come April, when daylight stretches long enough to suggest that play and noise are acceptable again. You bar the door. This is not dramatic, not a moment of decision or fear, simply part of the evening routine like washing your hands or removing your outer coat. The bar is a length of oak that fits into iron brackets on either side of the doorframe, and it drops into place with a solid thunk that marks the official transition from day to night, from outside to inside, from movement to stillness. The shutters are already closed over the 2 small windows, latched from within. You built those shutters yourself, using wood you couldn't really spare, because windows without protection felt too much like vulnerabilities, like eyes that could see both ways. At night, you prefer walls to be walls, solid and unambiguous. The evening meal is simple, a thin stew made from dried beans, a few pieces of salt pork for flavor, bread that's more dense than you'd like because flour must be stretched as far as it will go. You eat slowly, not savoring exactly, but extending the meal because afterwards there's not much to do except wait for sleep. Conversation is minimal. Your wife mentions that she'll need to mend one of the boys' shirts tomorrow, that the thread is running low, that perhaps in spring, when the supply wagon comes through again, you might remember to purchase more. You nod, file this away with the 100 other small necessities that accumulate across winter, like snow accumulating on a roof. Each one light, together they represent weight that must be considered. The boys eat without complaint, without the fidgeting and questions that characterize their summer meals. They've learned, as all children in frontier settlements learn, that winter imposes a kind of stillness on the body and mind, a conservation of energy that's not quite the same as sadness, but shares some of its characteristics. After the meal, your wife clears the wooden bowls and spoons, washes them in water that was heated at the edge of the hearth. You sit near the fire, not reading, books are scarce, and besides, the lamplight is too dim and precious to waste on evening reading, but simply sitting, your hands resting on your knees, your gaze fixed on the flames that consume the wood you split this afternoon. The fire is the heart of the cabin, the only source of heat and light that doesn't require careful rationing. It burns constantly from October through March, never allowed to die completely, because starting a new fire with flint and steel in deep cold is difficult enough that you'd rather wake every few hours to add wood than face a cold hearth in the morning. The boys settle onto their sleeping pallet earlier than they would in summer, bundled in wool blankets that have been in your wife's family for 2 generations. They don't ask for stories tonight. Some nights you tell them things, tales from your own childhood, fragments of history, simple fables with obvious morals, but tonight they seem to understand without being told that this is a quiet evening, a night for listening rather than speaking. Your wife joins them shortly after, lying down but not sleeping, her eyes open and reflecting the firelight in small, steady points. You remain by the fire, as you do most nights, because someone should tend it, and because you've found that sleep comes more reluctantly to you with each passing winter, as though your body is slowly forgetting how to fully rest during the dark months. The cabin settles around you with small sounds, the creaking of logs as they contract in the cold, the occasional pop from the fire as sap trapped in the wood expands and bursts, the rustle of straw in the mattresses as someone shifts position. Outside, the wind has picked up slightly, moving around the cabin in circular patterns that make the structure feel almost like a boat, a small vessel of warmth and light adrift in a dark, cold sea. Then, from somewhere beyond the walls, you hear it, not loud, not close, but clear enough that there's no mistaking what it is. A long, rising howl that starts low and climbs higher before breaking off, leaving a silence that feels heavier than the sound itself. You don't move. Your wife doesn't move. The boys become perfectly still, their breathing barely audible. The dog, lying near the door, lifts his head, and his ears press flat against his skull, but he doesn't bark, doesn't growl, makes no sound at all. This is the beginning of the night as you've come to know it, not the darkness itself, but what moves through the darkness, what uses it as a medium for sound to travel across frozen ground and through bare trees. The howl comes again, and this time it's answered from a different direction. Farther away, the second voice lower in pitch, more like a statement than a question. You've heard wolves before, heard them most nights this winter, in fact, and you know they're not immediately outside your door. They're probably still at the tree line, possibly beyond it, using the forest as cover while they move through their territory or communicate across distances that would take you an hour to walk. But knowing this doesn't change the fact of their presence, doesn't alter the way their voices reshape the night into something that feels inhabited, observed, less fully yours than it seemed when you barred the door. You add another log to the fire, not because it needs it yet, but because the act of moving, of doing something purposeful, helps to ground you in the immediate space of the cabin, rather than letting your attention drift outward toward the sounds beyond the walls. The bark catches quickly, and flames spread across the new wood, creating more light and more shadow simultaneously, making the cabin's interior feel both more protected and more isolated. Time moves differently after dark in winter. Without the reference points of sun position or work rhythms, without the natural divisions of morning tasks and afternoon chores, the hours seem to stretch and compress unpredictably. Sometimes 15 minutes feels like an hour. Sometimes you look up and realize that 2 hours have passed while you've been sitting motionless, watching the fire, listening to the night outside. The howling continues intermittently, sometimes a single voice, sometimes 2 or 3, in a kind of chorus that rises and falls with patterns you can almost but never quite predict. The sounds aren't constant. They come in waves separated by long silences that might be 15 minutes or might be 45. You've stopped trying to measure. During the silences, you listen even more intently because somehow the absence of sound feels more significant than its presence, as though the wolves are choosing when to announce themselves and when to move quietly. Your mind begins its familiar night work, the slow cataloguing of sounds and their probable sources. That creaking is just the cabin logs. That soft thump is snow sliding off the roof. That distant crack is a tree branch breaking under the weight of ice. You've learned to pass the soundscape of winter nights, to separate the ordinary from the potentially concerning, though you're also aware that this skill is imperfect, that your interpretations are educated guesses rather than certainties. The wind shifts direction and you hear the howling more clearly now, close enough that you can distinguish individual voices, can hear the way one wolf starts and another joins in slightly off rhythm creating a brief dissonance before they align. Your wife sits up slowly, carefully, trying not to disturb the boys, though you suspect they're not sleeping either, just lying still with their eyes closed because that's what children do when they're frightened but don't want to admit it. She looks at you across the dim cabin and you exchange no words, no gestures, just a glance that acknowledges what you're both thinking. They're closer tonight than they were last night. This is how it goes in deep winter. The wolves start the season at a comfortable distance, somewhere out in the deeper forest where their presence is theoretical rather than immediate. But as the weeks progress and food becomes scarcer, as deer populations thin out and smaller prey becomes harder to find, the wolves' territory gradually expands. Their hunting patterns bring them nearer to the settlements, to the edges of human habitation, where livestock and dogs and the scent of stored food creates a kind of gravitational pull. You've never seen a wolf attack a cabin, you've never heard of one breaking through a barred door or clawing through a shuttered window, but you've heard stories, third-hand accounts, tales passed around at the settlement gathering, rumors that may or may not be true, of wolves taking livestock from poorly secured pens, of dogs that went outside and never returned, of a man who left his cabin during a winter night for reasons no one could quite explain and was found 3 days later a quarter-mile into the forest. The stories are vague, probably exaggerated, possibly invented entirely, but they exist in your mind nonetheless, adding weight to the howling that continues outside. Around midnight, though you're guessing based on nothing more than feel, the dog stands up and walks to the door. He presses his nose against the gap at the bottom where a thin line of cold air seeps in, and he inhales deeply, repeatedly, gathering information from the scents that drift across the clearing. His tail is low, not tucked, but cautious, and when he exhales, his breath creates small clouds of condensation that hang in the air for a moment before dissipating. You watch him carefully because the dog's reactions are often more reliable than your own senses. He can hear frequencies you cannot, smell things that are invisible to you, sense movement and presence with an acuity that your human limitations cannot match. If he were barking, you'd be more worried. Barking means immediate threat, something close enough to demand a defensive response. But this quiet attention, this focused listening and smelling, suggests that the wolves are near but not pressing, present but not aggressive. Still, the dog doesn't return to his sleeping spot. He remains at the door, standing guard in his own way. And you realize you're grateful for his presence, for this creature whose instincts are more attuned to the dangers of winter nights than your own. The boys eventually fall asleep. You can tell by the change in their breathing, the way their bodies fully relax instead of maintaining that tense stillness of forced rest. Your wife dozes intermittently, waking whenever the howling resumes, her hand moving slightly under the blanket as though reaching for something to hold on to. You remain awake, feeding the fire every hour or so, keeping the cabin warm enough that the cold doesn't become dangerous, but not so warm that you waste precious wood. The night stretches on, marked not by clock time but by the rhythm of wolf calls and silences, by the progression of the fire from bright flames to glowing coals and back to flames again. You think about spring, about how it will feel when daylight lasts long enough to finish a full day's work, when the forest becomes a place you can enter without careful planning and heightened vigilance, when the nights are short enough that they don't require this constant, low-grade alertness, but spring is still months away, February and March still to endure, still to survive. Around what you estimate to be 3 or 4 in the morning, the howling stops completely, not gradually, not fading into the distance, but suddenly, as though someone gave a signal that you couldn't hear. The silence that follows is profound, almost physical, and somehow more unsettling than the howling itself. When wolves are calling, you know where they are, can estimate their distance and direction. When they fall silent, they could be anywhere, moving without sound across snow-covered ground, repositioning themselves in ways you cannot track or predict. You sit very still and listen to the silence, trying to hear beneath it, trying to detect any sound that might indicate movement or presence. The wind has died down too, leaving an almost perfect stillness that makes even the crackling of the fire seem intrusive, too loud. Minutes pass, possibly half an hour. The silence continues, and gradually you feel some of the tension easing from your shoulders, your jaw, places where you didn't realize you were holding tightness. Perhaps they've moved on. Perhaps they've found something more interesting than your cabin, some other trail to follow through the winter night. You add another log to the fire and allow yourself to think about sleeping, about closing your eyes for a few hours before dawn requires you to be alert again. Then the dog growls, a low, sustained sound that comes from deep in his chest, almost subsonic. His eyes are fixed on the door, his body rigid, every line of him focused on something you cannot see or hear. You stand up slowly, moving toward the door but not touching it, not opening it, just positioning yourself to listen more carefully. At first, you hear nothing unusual, then very faintly you detect what might be breathing, slow, deliberate exhalations that are barely audible over the ambient sounds of night. Or perhaps it's just the wind returning, air moving through the gaps in the cabin's construction. You cannot be certain. The dog's growl continues, steady and low, more warning than threat. You place a hand on his head, not to silence him, but to steady yourself, to maintain contact with something real and present, while you try to understand what's happening just beyond the barrier of your door. The breathing sound, if that's what it is, doesn't move closer or farther away. It simply persists, patient and calm, as though whatever is out there has no need to rush, no urgency driving its actions. You realize your heart is beating harder, faster, though your body is motionless. This is the essence of winter night fear, not panic, not terror, but a sustained, quiet anxiety that lives in the space between the known and unknown, between what you can verify and what you can only imagine. Minutes accumulate. The dog's growl eventually subsides, though he doesn't relax, doesn't return to his sleeping spot. The breathing sound, if it was ever really there, fades into the general ambiguity of night sounds, becomes impossible to distinguish from wind or snow or the creaking of frozen wood. Slowly, so slowly you barely notice the transition, the quality of darkness outside begins to change. Not lighter yet, but less dense, less absolute. The edge of dawn is still hours away, but some subtle shift in the atmosphere suggests that the deepest part of night has passed, that you're beginning the slow climb back toward daylight. You return to your spot by the fire and sit down again, your body heavy with fatigue that you can feel but cannot fully surrender to. The cabin is warm, your family is safe, the door is barred, and the shutters are latched, and the fire is burning steadily. These are facts, concrete and verifiable. But they exist alongside another fact that is equally true. Somewhere outside, possibly close, possibly distant, wolves are moving through the winter darkness, and their presence shapes your experience of night in ways that cannot be reasoned away or dismissed. You will do this again tomorrow. You will bar the door as darkness falls. You will tend the fire through the long hours. You will listen to the howling and the silences. You will measure safety in small increments and wait for dawn with a patience that feels less like virtue and more like endurance. This is what it means to be a settler in deep winter, when wolves come close enough to be heard. This is the rhythm of your nights now, repeated endlessly until spring arrives and releases you temporarily from this cycle of vigilance and waiting. The fire burns down to coals again, and you add more wood, watching the bark catch and curl, watching small flames spread across the new surface. Outside, the first birds will begin calling in another hour or two, marking the approach of dawn with sounds that feel friendly, domesticated, safe. But that hour is not here yet. For now, there is only this: the warm cabin, the sleeping family, the patient dog, and the darkness beyond your walls that holds whatever it holds, reveals nothing, and waits with a patience that matches your own. Let us drift now from the general experience of winter nights to one particular winter, one particular man whose words have survived in fragments, brief entries in a worn ledger, letters sent but rarely answered, notes written by lamplight when sleep would not come. His name was Yakov Petrovich Morozov, though in the settlement records he appears simply as Morozov, farmer, arrived 1807, cabin established on the northeastern boundary where the forest presses closest. The ledger itself, now preserved in a regional archive, shows the wear of constant handling, its leather cover cracked along the spine, its pages darkened by smoke and time. Someone, perhaps Morozov himself, perhaps a family member, kept this book safe through moves and years, recognizing in its sparse entries something worth preserving. He was not a writer by nature or training. His entries are spare, functional, concerned mainly with weather and work, and the small arithmetic of survival: how much firewood remains, how many days until supplies might be replenished, whether the roof will hold through another heavy snow. The handwriting itself tells a story, letters formed with deliberate care, occasional misspellings corrected with a single careful line, dates underscored as though to anchor each entry in time. This is the writing of a man for whom literacy represents achievement, education arrived at through effort rather than birthright. But threaded through these practical notations, appearing with increasing frequency as winter deepens, are observations about wolves. Brief mentions at first, almost casual, the way one might note the presence of wind or the quality of moonlight. The wolves enter his record the way weather enters it, as fact, as condition, as element of the environment that shapes daily decisions. There is no drama in these first mentions, no sense that they mark the beginning of anything significant. Then, as the season progresses, something shifts in his attention in the space these observations occupy on the page. November 12, 1811. The first entry that mentions wolves appears on this date, written in the careful script of a man who learned letters late in life and still treats writing as a formal act, something requiring concentration and correct posture. "Heard wolves in the far wood tonight," he writes, nothing more. No elaboration, no emotion, just a fact recorded among other facts. The temperature at sunset, the amount of grain remaining in the barrel, a reminder to repair the roof's eastern corner before the next storm. The wolves are part of the landscape, notable but not yet significant, distant as the mountains that mark the western horizon. In the context of November 12th, this notation occupies perhaps a tenth of the space on the page, wedged between more pressing concerns about winter preparation. The brevity itself is telling. Wolves in the far wood are common enough not to warrant detailed commentary. By November 20th, his entries have developed a pattern. Each evening's notation includes a line about the wolves, their distance, their direction, whether they called once or many times. Wolves to the north, 3 or 4 voices. Wolves near the creek bed, heard around midnight. No wolves tonight, wind too strong perhaps. The observations are still factual, unmarked by commentary, but their consistent presence suggests something, a new habit of attention, a recognition that these sounds have become part of the structure of his nights. He does not explain why he records these details, what purpose they serve beyond simple documentation. Perhaps he himself did not yet know why he tracked them, why his pen moved to record howls in the same methodical way it recorded snowfall or the number of eggs collected. The practice preceded the understanding, but the fact that he records them at all tells us something about how his awareness is changing, how the wolves are moving from background to foreground in his nightly experience. December arrives, and his entries grow slightly longer, as though the shortened days and extended nights create more time for writing, or perhaps more need for it, a way to mark the hours, to give shape to time that otherwise feels formless and slow. The lengthening entries coincide with the deepest cold, the period when the sun barely clears the tree line before beginning its descent, when morning chores bleed directly into evening preparations with scarcely any midday between. Time itself becomes strange in these conditions, measured not by clock, but by task, by the cycle of fire tending and darkness. December 3rd, heavy snow through morning, cleared by afternoon, managed to split half a cord before darkness. Wolves very close tonight, perhaps at the clearing's edge. The dog would not settle. Maria asked if we should be concerned. I told her no, though I am less certain than I pretended. This is the first time emotion enters his record, the first acknowledgement that the wolves represent something beyond simple fact. His uncertainty is understated, almost apologetic, as though he's embarrassed by his own apprehension. But it's there now, visible on the page, and once acknowledged it begins to appear more frequently in subsequent entries. The admission of uncertainty marks a turning point, not in the wolves' behavior, which likely remained consistent, but in Morozov's willingness to recognize and record his response to that behavior. What was ambient becomes focal, what was noted becomes felt. December 9th. Wolves again, closer than before, could hear them moving through the brush near the woodpile. Did not go out to investigate. Maria says the children are sleeping poorly. December 14th. Tracks in the snow this morning, perhaps 20 feet from the door. Large prints, several animals. They circled the cabin at some point during the night. I reinforced the chicken coop. The decision not to investigate, not to open the door and confront the sounds in darkness, represents a kind of wisdom born from frontier experience. One does not chase wolves into the night with a lantern and an axe, unless circumstances demand it. December 18th. The nearest neighbour, Petrov, came by at midday to borrow an axe. He mentioned wolves have taken 2 of his chickens despite the enclosed pen. He seemed more angry than worried, spoke of organising a hunt come January when the snow is firmer. I nodded but said nothing. I am not sure what hunting them would accomplish. His entries from late December into early January form a kind of narrative, though he likely didn't intend them as such, just a series of observations that accumulate into something larger, a portrait of how sustained proximity to wolves reshapes daily life and nightly routine. The narrative emerges accidentally, the way meaning emerges from any sustained attention to a single subject over time. Morozov was documenting days. We, reading a century later, perceive a story. January the 2nd, 1812. New Year has come and we mark it quietly. No visitors, roads impassable. Wolves every night now, sometimes early evening, before full darkness. The children have stopped asking about the sounds. They know what makes them. The children's silence speaks volumes. This is how fear becomes normalized, how the extraordinary becomes ordinary through repetition. The adults need no longer explain or reassure because the situation has simply become the condition of winter. January the 7th. A long night, the wolves began calling around sunset and continued past midnight. At one point I counted 5 distinct voices, possibly more. Maria sat up with me by the fire. We did not speak much. There is not much to say. January 11th. I have begun leaving the axe near the door within reach. Maria noticed, but did not comment. The dog sleeps against the door now, moves there as soon as we bar it for the night. He knows something we perhaps do not allow ourselves to fully acknowledge. The dog's behavior serves as confirmation of instinct, of animal understanding that operates beneath human rationalization. Morozov notes this with a kind of rueful respect. The dog is honest about the danger in a way humans, with their need for courage and composure, cannot quite manage. January 15th. Today I walked to Petrov's cabin to return his axe. The snow was deep, the walk difficult. He offered tea, and we sat by his fire. His wife was mending in the corner. I asked if his wolves had returned after the chickens were taken. He said they had not, but then he paused and corrected himself. They had not taken more chickens, but he hears them constantly every night, sometimes during late afternoon. He asked if I thought they were the same wolves or different ones. I had no answer. How would one know? This question, how would one know, appears again in a later entry, suggesting it stayed with him, became something he turned over in his mind during the long hours of night watch. The question is about identification, about whether the wolves that circle one cabin are the same that circle another, whether there is intention in their patterns or merely instinct, hunger, territorial routine. But beneath the surface question lies something deeper, the desire to understand what is watching you, to assign identity and therefore predictability to something that remains fundamentally unknown. If these are the same wolves night after night, then perhaps their behavior can be anticipated, their movements mapped, their danger assessed and managed. If they are different wolves, then the forest contains multitudes, and safety is even more uncertain than it appears. Morozov carries this question through January like a stone in his pocket, something to turn over during wakeful hours. January 22nd. 3 weeks now of constant presence. I am sleeping in short intervals, waking whenever silence falls. The silence is worse than the howling. When they call, at least I know where they are. This observation that silence provokes more anxiety than sound reveals how thoroughly Morozov has adapted to the wolves' presence. His nervous system has recalibrated, learned to track them through absence as much as through sound. January the 28th. Maria asked me this morning why I'm always listening. I did not realize it was so obvious. She said I pause mid-sentence, mid-task, turn my head slightly as though hearing something she cannot. I told her it was nothing, but she looked at me in a way that suggested she understood more than I had said. She has been listening too. The fact that Maria has noticed means the listening has become visible behavior, something Morozov does unconsciously throughout the day. His attention is divided now between the task at hand and the auditory landscape beyond the cabin walls. The entries from early February show a man adapting to a new normal, finding ways to function within a situation that has become permanent rather than temporary. His observations become more detailed, more analytical, as though studying the wolves might give him some measure of control over their presence. February 3rd. I have noticed patterns in their calling. They seem to move in a wide circle around the settlement, visiting each cabin's vicinity over the course of several nights. They called from the south last night. Tonight they will likely be east, near the Kozlov place. Tomorrow perhaps they will have moved on, given us a night of quiet. Or perhaps this pattern I perceive is imaginary, meaning imposed where none exists. February 9th. The snow has been particularly heavy this week. The wolves' tracks are everywhere, around the cabin, near the barn, crossing the path I cut to the woodpile. In daylight I follow these tracks sometimes, seeing where they lead. Usually they circle and move back toward the forest. Once they led to a spot perhaps 30 feet from my door where the snow was compressed, as though something had lain there for a time, waiting or resting. I stood in that spot and looked back at my cabin, seeing it from the perspective of whatever had been there. The windows showed faint light even in afternoon. The smoke from the chimney was visible. A dog barked from within. I wondered what this looked like to wolf eyes, what information could be gathered from these signs of habitation. This moment, standing in the compressed snow, looking back at his own home through wolf eyes, represents a kind of imaginative leap, an attempt to bridge the gap between human and animal understanding. Morozov tries to see his cabin as the wolves might see it, source of warmth, sound, movement, potential danger, or potential prey. The exercise does not bring comfort, but it brings a different kind of knowledge, the recognition that his home is simultaneously fortress and beacon, protection and advertisement. Every light in the window announces presence, every curl of smoke maps human activity. February 16th. Petrov came by again, this time with Kozlov. They are still talking about a hunt. They want me to join them, say that 3 men with guns would be enough to drive the wolves farther back, maybe kill 1 or 2 as a warning to the others. I asked what warning wolves would take from the death of pack members. Petrov had no answer but seemed irritated by the question. Kozlov said something about showing them we are not prey. I said I would think about it. After they left, Maria asked if I would go. I said no. She seemed relieved. This refusal to join the hunt marks something important in Morozov's journal, a recognition that violence against the wolves would not solve what troubles him, because what troubles him is not really the wolves themselves, but the way their presence has altered his relationship to night, to his home, to the landscape he thought he understood when he chose to settle here. Petrov and Kozlov seek action, the satisfaction of response to threat, the reassertion of human dominance through firepower. Morozov has moved past this impulse, or perhaps never felt it strongly. His entries suggest a man more inclined to observation than to conquest. The relief Maria expresses tells its own story. Perhaps she fears for his safety on such a hunt, or perhaps she recognizes, as he does, that killing wolves would not restore the peace they've lost. February 24th. A strange night. The wolves came very close, so close I could hear their breathing between the howls. But they did not challenge the cabin, did not test the door, or circle aggressively. They simply were there, present and patient. At one point the howling stopped, and I heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, moving along the cabin's north wall. The dog heard them too, but did not bark, only pressed himself lower to the floor and watched the door with an intensity that suggested he knew something I did not. The footsteps passed. The howling resumed from a greater distance. By morning there were tracks in the snow, showing exactly what I had heard. A single wolf had approached the cabin, walked its length, then returned to wherever the others waited. This encounter, intimate yet non-violent, close yet controlled, seems to represent something different from the earlier circling and calling. The wolf approaches alone, investigates, withdraws according to some plan or instinct Morozov cannot fathom. The dog's response is equally mysterious, not the barking of an animal defending territory, but the frozen watchfulness of an animal recognizing something beyond its ability to challenge. Perhaps the dog sensed that this wolf meant no immediate harm, or perhaps it simply knew that barking would accomplish nothing. March 1st. The days are beginning to lengthen, not dramatically yet, but enough to notice. Darkness comes at 5 instead of 4:30. This small addition of daylight feels significant, like a promise that winter will eventually release us. The wolves are still present, but seem less insistent, as though they too feel the change of season approaching. March 8th. Kozlov stopped by to tell me that he and Petrov went on their hunt 3 days ago. They tracked wolves for most of a day, never got close enough for a clear shot. Petrov wanted to continue, but Kozlov convinced him to turn back before darkness fell. He said the experience gave him a new respect for how wolves move through the forest, silent, efficient, always aware of where the humans are. He laughed when he said this, but the laugh sounded uncertain. I think the hunt taught him something he had not expected to learn. The failed hunt becomes its own kind of education, not the lesson Petrov and Kozlov intended to teach the wolves, but the lesson the wolves taught them about the limits of human mastery in this landscape. They went into the forest as hunters and returned as men who had been, themselves, constantly observed and avoided. Kozlov's uncertain laugh suggests he grasps the implications of this reversal, understands that the wolves were never in danger because they knew, every moment, where the humans were and how to stay beyond rifle range. The forest belongs to the wolves in a way it will never belong to the settlers, no matter how many cabins they build or how many trees they clear. March 15th. I have been thinking about fear and how it changes over time. In November, when the wolves first began their nightly calls, I felt a sharp, immediate anxiety, something that made my heart beat faster, made me alert and tense. Now, 3 months later, the anxiety has dulled into something else. Not comfort, exactly, but a kind of accommodation. The fear is still present, but it has become part of the background, like cold or hunger, or the ache in my back from cutting wood. I live with it rather than react to it. I am not sure if this is wisdom or merely exhaustion. This reflection shows Morozov's characteristic honesty about his own psychological state. He does not claim to have overcome fear or grown brave through exposure. He has simply grown accustomed, learned to function despite persistent anxiety. The question he poses, whether this accommodation represents wisdom or exhaustion, touches on something fundamental about frontier life, about how much of survival is simply endurance, the ability to continue functioning while afraid, cold, uncertain, and alone. Perhaps wisdom and exhaustion are not opposites, but partners, two aspects of the same hard-won adaptation. March 22nd. Warmer today, snow melting in patches. The wolves were distant last night, their calls faint and sporadic. Maria commented that she barely noticed them. I realized I had noticed, I always notice, but that the noticing has become automatic, requires no conscious effort. They are part of the night now, as familiar as wind or the crackling of the fire. His final entries about wolves are brief, almost anticlimactic. March 29th. No wolves for 3 nights. The silence feels strange, almost unsettling. I catch myself listening for them. April 2nd. The wolves have moved on, following deer herds deeper into the forest as snow melts and prey becomes more mobile. The dog sleeps in the corner again, rather than by the door. The children are louder, more active. Maria is planning her garden. Spring has arrived, though I find myself missing the structure that winter imposed, the clear routines, the defined boundaries between inside and outside, the way each night had weight and meaning. Without the wolves, the nights feel empty, purposeless. I am not sure what this says about me. April 10th. I was talking with Petrov yesterday, and he mentioned the wolves casually, as one mentions weather from a previous season, something that happened and is now past. He has already forgotten the intensity of January, the way the nights felt during the deepest cold, or perhaps he has not forgotten but has chosen to set it aside, to treat it as an anomaly rather than a revelation. I find I cannot do this. The wolves are gone, but they have changed something in how I inhabit this place. I understand now that the cabin is not truly mine, that the forest is not backdrop but active presence, that the boundary between human settlement and wild land is thinner than I imagined when I first arrived here. This recognition that the cabin is not truly his, that ownership is a legal fiction maintained only so long as the forest permits it, represents the deepest understanding Morozov reaches through his winter with the wolves. He came to this land as a settler, someone claiming territory, imposing human order on wild space. He emerges from winter, understanding himself differently. not as owner, but as guest, not as conqueror, but as tolerated presence. The wolves taught him this not through aggression, but through patience, through their sustained presence at the edges of his cleared land, their nightly reminders that the forest existed before him and will continue after him. This is the last entry that mentions wolves. The remainder of the journal, which continues sporadically through 1812 and into early 1813, returns to practical matters, crop planning, repairs, the small commerce of frontier life. But the voice has changed slightly, become more reflective, more willing to acknowledge uncertainty. Morozov has lived through something that many settlers experience but few articulate. The slow transformation of fear into understanding, the recognition that sharing space with wildness requires not conquest but negotiation, not victory but coexistence. The practical entries that follow the wolf winter are marked by this change in tone. They remain concerned with survival and work, but they carry an undercurrent of awareness, a sense that every human action in this landscape is provisional, contingent, subject to forces beyond control or comprehension. When Morozov writes about planting crops, there is implicit acknowledgement that weather, wildlife, and 100 other factors will determine harvest. When he writes about repairs to the cabin, there is recognition that the structure itself is temporary, a brief imposition of order that will eventually yield back to forest. This is not pessimism, but realism, the hard-won wisdom of someone who has looked into the darkness and seen what looks back. In October 1813, Morozov writes one final entry relevant to our story. The wolves have returned with the cold weather. I heard them last night, distant but clear. Maria asked if I was worried. I told her no, and this time I was telling the truth. I am not worried, I am simply aware. The wolves will circle the cabin as they did last year. They will call in the darkness and fall silent before dawn. They will leave tracks in the snow and move through the forest with purpose I cannot fully comprehend. And I will tend my fire and listen to the night and wait for spring, knowing that this is the terms of life in this place, the agreement I made when I chose to build my cabin, where the forest presses close. It is not a comfortable arrangement, but it is honest. The wolves are not my enemies, they are my neighbors, and like all neighbors, we maintain a careful distance, respect each other's territory, and acknowledge each other's presence without seeking deeper understanding or intimacy. This entry represents Morozov's final statement on the matter, not triumphant, not resigned, but clear-eyed and accepting. He has reached an understanding with the wolves, or perhaps more accurately, an understanding of the wolves' indifference to human concerns. They are not enemies because they do not hate him. They are not friends because they do not know him. They are simply other beings sharing the same landscape according to their own needs and patterns. The comparison to neighbors is apt. In frontier settlements, neighbors often lived far enough apart that they rarely saw each other, communicated mainly through necessity, maintained politeness through distance. The wolves are neighbors of exactly this sort, acknowledged, respected, kept at arm's length. The journal ends in 1814, not with any final pronouncement or conclusion, but simply with a last entry about firewood inventory. Morozov himself remained in the settlement until 1821, when records indicate he sold his property and moved to a town further south where his children could attend a proper school. The decision to leave, coming nearly a decade after the wolf winter, was practical rather than dramatic. His children were growing, educational opportunities were limited on the frontier, and the relative prosperity of those years made relocation feasible. There is no indication that wolves influenced this decision, though one wonders whether the understanding he reached during that winter made it easier to let go, to accept that his tenure in that place was always temporary. There is no record of whether wolves troubled that new home, whether he missed the nights of listening and watching, whether some part of him remembered those winter months of 1811 and 1812 as the time when he most fully inhabited his life, alert, present, and aware of everything that moved in the darkness beyond his door. What remains is his journal, his careful notations, his slow journey from fear to understanding to something like acceptance. The journal itself passed through family hands before eventually being donated to an archive in the 1890s by a grandson who recognized its historical value. By that time, the frontier had moved west, the forests around that original settlement had been substantially logged, and wolves had become scarce in the region. The journal was catalogued, preserved, occasionally consulted by historians interested in settlement patterns or daily life on the frontier. But its real value lies not in the data it provides, but in the consciousness it reveals. One man's sustained attention to his own fear and adaptation. He was not a hero, did not overcome the wolves or drive them away. He simply lived through a winter when they came close and recorded what that experience felt like from the inside. His words are quiet, understated, marked by the same steady patience that characterized his nights by the fire. They tell us something that dramatic accounts and heroic narratives cannot, that the truest frontier experience was often not about triumph, but endurance. Not about conquering nature, but learning to exist within it, carrying fear without being destroyed by it, listening to the night, and hearing not just danger, but the complex reality of a world that existed long before humans arrived and would continue long after they departed. The heroic narratives of frontier life that dominated popular literature of the 19th century, tales of Indian fighters and bear hunters, of men who single-handedly carved civilization from wilderness, have their place in cultural history. But they obscure as much as they reveal, creating an expectation that frontier life was primarily about conquest and that successful settlers were those who dominated their environment through strength and courage. Morozov's journal offers a different model: the settler as observer, as student of the landscape, as someone who learns to read the signs and adapt to conditions rather than imposing his will upon them. This is perhaps a less dramatic story, but it is almost certainly more representative of how most people actually lived in frontier conditions. The wolves that circled Morozov's cabin were likely a small pack, perhaps 5 to 8 animals, following seasonal patterns that had repeated for generations before any Russian settlers arrived in that region. They came close to human habitation in winter because deep snow made hunting difficult, and human settlements, with their domestic animals and food storage, represented potential resources. They did not attack because the cabin was secure, the dog was vigilant, and Morozov himself never showed the kind of vulnerability, illness, injury, carelessness that might have invited predation. The relationship was one of mutual wariness, each species aware of the other's capacity for harm, each maintaining defensive positions. What makes Morozov's account valuable is not that this winter was unusual, surely many settlers experienced similar seasons, but that he recorded it with such consistent attention, tracking not just the wolves' behavior, but his own psychological adaptation to their presence. Most people, having lived through such a winter, would have few words for it afterward. They would remember being frightened, perhaps, or would tell a dramatic story about the night the wolves came closest. But the gradual process of accommodation, the way fear becomes familiar and then becomes something else, this is difficult to articulate and rarely attempted. Morozov, perhaps because writing was still somewhat novel and difficult for him, perhaps because the long, dark nights gave him time for reflection, managed to capture this process in real time. His journal entries form a kind of psychological map, tracing the territory between acute fear and acceptance, showing how that journey proceeds not in dramatic leaps but in small daily adjustments. The February entry where he stands in the compressed snow, looking back at his cabin through wolf eyes, represents the turning point the moment when he stops seeing the wolves purely as threat and begins to imagine them as beings with their own perspective, their own logic. And this does not make them less dangerous, but it makes them comprehensible in a new way. They are not demons or monsters, but animals following instincts and needs, assessing opportunities and risks according to calculations he cannot fully understand but can at least acknowledge as rational from their perspective. This shift in perception from threat to fellow creature is subtle but profound. It does not eliminate fear, but it contextualizes fear, makes it something that can be managed rather than something that must be overcome or escaped. Morozov never becomes comfortable with the wolves' presence, but he learns to function despite discomfort, to make decisions and maintain routines while knowing that danger lurks at the edge of the clearing. The question he raises in March, whether his accommodation represents wisdom or exhaustion, speaks to the ambiguity of adaptation. Is learning to live with chronic fear a valuable skill or a kind of resignation? Is the ability to function despite persistent anxiety a strength or a wearing down of natural protective responses? Morozov does not answer these questions, and perhaps they have no single answer. What matters is that he continues to split wood, to tend fires, to care for his family, to maintain the cabin and plan for spring. The wolves do not stop him from living, they change how he lives, adding a layer of vigilance and awareness to every action. The journal also reveals something about Maria, Morozov's wife, though she appears only through his observations and brief mentions of her comments. She clearly shares his awareness of the wolves. She asks about his listening. She sits up with him during the long night in January. She notices when he places the axe by the door. But her expressions of concern are practical rather than fearful, asking whether they should be worried, noting that the children sleep poorly, seeming relieved when he decides not to join the hunt. She is managing her own adaptation to the situation, while also managing the household and the children's responses. One imagines that she too was listening through those winter nights, tracking the wolves' calls and silences, calculating distances and dangers. But she left no written record, and Morozov's journal gives us only glimpses of her experience filtered through his own. This is typical of frontier journals. They capture one perspective, usually male, usually focused on external events and practical matters. The interior lives of women and children, their fears and adaptations and understandings, remain largely invisible. We can infer Maria's experience from Morozov's comments, but we cannot know it directly. This limitation reminds us that every historical document, no matter how detailed, captures only fragments of the lived reality it describes. The children, similarly, appear only in passing. They stop asking about the sounds, they sleep poorly in December, they become louder and more active when spring arrives. These brief notations suggest significant stress and adaptation. Children who stop asking questions about frightening sounds have likely been told there is nothing to worry about so many times that they have learned not to seek reassurance. They cope by accepting the situation as normal, incorporating fear into the background of daily life. This is not a comfortable process, and one wonders what long-term effects such a winter might have had on young minds. Did they grow up more vigilant, more aware of dangers, more respectful of wilderness? Or did they simply absorb their parents' message that fear must be borne silently and learn to suppress their own anxiety? The dog, mentioned several times, serves as a kind of barometer of danger throughout the journal. Dogs, with their superior hearing and instinctive responses to predators, often alert humans to threats before those threats become visible or obvious. Morozov's dog moves to sleep by the door, a defensive position, guarding the most vulnerable point of entry. The dog refuses to settle when wolves are very close, presses itself to the floor during the close encounter in February, returns to sleeping in the corner when the wolves depart in April. These behavioral changes parallel and validate Morozov's own responses, confirming that his anxiety is not imaginary or excessive, but proportional to actual danger. The dog knows, and its knowledge is more reliable than human rationalization. Petrov and Kozlov, the neighbors who appear periodically in the journal, represent different responses to the wolf problem. Petrov, who loses chickens and advocates for a hunt, embodies the aggressive response. Threat should be met with counter-threat, predators should be killed or driven off, human dominance should be asserted through violence. Kozlov seems less certain, more willing to consider alternatives, but he goes along with Petrov's plan for the hunt. Their failure to even get a shot at the wolves during a full day of tracking teaches them something that Morozov already understood. The wolves are not vulnerable to casual hunting, are too wary and mobile to be easily killed by farmers with rifles. Kozlov's uncertain laugh when describing the experience suggests recognition of this truth, acknowledgement that the wolves were always in control of the encounter, allowing themselves to be tracked just closely enough to keep the humans interested, but never close enough to be endangered. This is humbling knowledge, and it explains why Kozlov does not propose a second hunt. The seasonal pattern Morozov describes, wolves arriving with deep winter and departing with spring, aligns with what we know of wolf behavior in regions with harsh winters and migratory prey. As snow deepens, deer and other prey animals become more vulnerable but also more mobile, moving to areas where food is accessible. Wolves follow these movements, and their routes take them through territories that include human settlements. In early spring, as snow melts and prey disperses to summer ranges, wolf packs adjust their territories accordingly, often moving away from human habitation. Morozov's wolves were thus following ancient patterns that preceded human settlement by millennia. The fact that their route brought them close to his cabin was incidental to their purposes. They were hunting prey, defending territory, surviving winter according to strategies encoded in instinct and learned through pack behavior. That Morozov's cabin happened to sit at the edge of their winter territory was simply circumstance, a consequence of where he had chosen to build. Understanding this pattern, that the wolves were not targeting him, but simply moving through a landscape that happened to include his land, is part of what allows Morozov to eventually see them as neighbors rather than enemies. They are not there because of him, they are there despite him, following needs that have nothing to do with human presence. This realization is oddly comforting. It means their behavior is not personal, not motivated by hostility or aggression toward humans specifically. They circle the cabin because it is an obstacle in their territory, something to be monitored and avoided or circumvented. If Morozov remains behind his walls and tends his fire and does not venture out in darkness, the wolves have no reason to challenge him. The covenant he describes in his October 1813 entry, mutual respect, maintain distance, acknowledgement without intimacy, is based on this understanding. The wolves will do what wolves do, he will do what humans do, and as long as neither violates the other's space, coexistence is possible. The journal's ending in 1814 with a mundane entry about firewood reminds us that life continues beyond dramatic events. The wolf winter was significant, transformative even, but it was not everything. Morozov still needed to cut wood, repair tools, plant crops, raise children. The everyday work of survival went on, incorporating the lessons learned but not dwelling endlessly on crisis. This, too, is characteristic of frontier life. Dramatic events punctuate long stretches of routine, and survival depends on maintaining that routine regardless of what has come before. One cannot spend all day contemplating wolves when there is wood to be split and fields to be prepared for planting. Morozov's departure from the settlement in 1821 closes the circle of his frontier experience. He came in 1807, built his cabin, established his farm, lived through seasons and years, including the wolf winter, and eventually decided to leave for his children's sake. This trajectory was common. Many frontier settlers were motivated not by love of wilderness, but by economic necessity or opportunity. They endured isolation and danger as temporary conditions, planning eventually to move somewhere more settled, where their children could access education, where medical care was available, where community and commerce made life less precarious. That Morozov lasted 14 years in that location suggests he found something worthwhile there, or at least something sustainable, a life that, despite its hardships and fears, provided adequately for his family and allowed him a degree of autonomy impossible in more settled regions. The frontier offered freedom from certain social hierarchies, from the watchful eyes of authorities and landlords, from the rigid expectations of town and village life. This freedom came with costs, isolation, danger, the constant press of physical labor, but for many it was a trade worth making, at least for a time. Morozov's journal suggests someone who took that trade seriously, who did not romanticize frontier life, but approached it with sober awareness of both its benefits and its burdens. The wolf winter was part of that burden, one season among many when the costs of frontier living became particularly visible and immediate. But it was not enough to drive him away, not then. He stayed another 7 years, which means he experienced at least 7 more winters in that cabin, presumably with wolves returning each cold season, circling and calling and leaving tracks in the snow. That he stopped writing about them after 1813 does not mean they ceased to be present. It means only that they had become so thoroughly incorporated into his understanding of that place that they no longer seemed worth documenting. The extraordinary had become ordinary, the frightening had become familiar. This is how humans adapt to almost anything, through repetition, through small daily acceptances, through the gradual erosion of novelty until even terror can feel routine. The historical context surrounding Morozov's journal enriches our understanding of his experience. The years 1811–1812 were turbulent ones in Russian history, though the effects of Napoleon's invasion and the subsequent war reached frontier settlements only as distant rumors and occasional demands for supplies or conscripts. Morozov never mentions these larger events in his journal, suggesting that either news traveled slowly to his remote location, or that the immediate pressures of survival left little energy for concern about distant wars. For someone living at the edge of settled territory, the wolves at his door were a more immediate threat than French armies hundreds of miles away. This reminds us that historical experience is always local as well as global. The great events that fill history books were, for many people, less significant than weather, wolves, and the daily struggle to maintain shelter and food. Morozov's journal, in its careful attention to immediate and practical matters, gives us access to this local, lived history in ways that accounts of battles and treaties cannot. The preservation of the journal itself involves a degree of chance. Many similar documents were lost, used as kindling, destroyed by water or fire, thrown away by descendants who saw no value in their ancestors' scribblings about firewood and wolves. That Morozov's grandson recognized the journal's value and donated it to an archive suggests that family stories about that frontier life, perhaps about the wolf winter specifically, had been passed down and maintained some significance across generations. Or perhaps the grandson was simply a careful person who preserved family documents as a matter of principle, not knowing that this particular journal would eventually be consulted by historians and readers seeking to understand frontier experience. Either way, we are fortunate to have these spare pages with their patient notations. In an age increasingly distant from the frontier experience, when wolves have been eliminated from much of their historic range, and when wilderness itself has become something cordoned off in parks and preserves, Morozov's journal offers a window into a different relationship between humans and wild animals. It shows us a time when coexistence was necessity rather than choice, when the boundary between human and wild was negotiated nightly, when fear was not abstract but immediate and embodied. Reading his entries, we can almost hear the wolves ourselves, almost feel the tension of those long winter nights when every sound beyond the door required interpretation and response. The literary quality of Morozov's writing, its restraint, its attention to detail, its emotional honesty, is all the more remarkable given that he was not trying to create literature. He was simply recording his days, keeping track of information that seemed important to remember. That this practical documentation also functions as narrative, as psychological portrait, as philosophical reflection on human relationship to nature, speaks to the way lived experience, when recorded with sufficient attention and honesty, transcends its immediate purposes. Morozov was trying to remember how much firewood he had. He created, inadvertently, a document about fear, adaptation, and understanding. The two-sentence paragraph structure of much of his journal, one sentence for the fact, one sentence for the reflection or consequence, creates a rhythm that mirrors the way thought actually works when one is engaged in both physical labor and mental processing. Action and reflection alternate, neither dominating, each informing the other. This structure also forces a kind of concision. There is no room for elaborate description or extended analysis, only for the essential observation and its immediate meaning. The style suits both Morozov's limited literacy and his situation, where long hours of physical work left little energy for extensive writing, but did create space for brief, focused notation. Modern readers accustomed to more elaborate prose and explicit emotional expression might initially find Morozov's entries too spare, too restrained. But this very restraint gives them power. We feel the fear precisely because he does not exaggerate it. We understand the transformation precisely because he does not oversell it. When he writes, "I am not sure what this says about me," in response to missing the wolves' presence, the understated confession carries more weight than pages of elaborate self-analysis could achieve. He trusts the reader, or perhaps more accurately, does not think about readers at all, simply records the truth as he understands it, and lets that truth speak for itself. The wolves themselves remain mysterious throughout the journal, as they must. Morozov cannot know their intentions, cannot understand their decision-making, cannot predict with certainty what they will do. This unknowability is central to their power in his narrative. They represent everything that cannot be controlled or fully comprehended, everything that resists human ordering and explanation. They are, in a sense, the wilderness itself made manifest, given voice and form and purpose, that operates entirely outside human concerns. That Morozov learns to accept this unknowability, to live with uncertainty rather than demanding resolution, marks his deepest adaptation. He stops asking why and starts asking how to function while afraid, how to maintain routines while alert, how to exist in a landscape that does not belong to him and never will. The transformation from settler to inhabitant, from owner to guest, happens gradually through the winter, catalyzed by wolves, but encompassing a broader recognition about the nature of frontier life. One does not own land in any meaningful sense when that land can be visited nightly by predators, when the forest presses close and darkness brings unknown dangers. Legal ownership, recorded in distant offices, means little when the reality on the ground involves negotiation with forces that recognize no human law. This does not make settlement impossible. Morozov and his family clearly survived and continued, but it changes the terms of settlement, makes it provisional and contingent in ways that urban land ownership is not. The cabin provides real protection, the cleared land yields crops, the chicken coop can be reinforced against predators. But none of this represents conquest, only temporary accommodation, an agreement that holds only as long as both parties, human and wild, maintain their positions. Should Morozov abandon the cabin for even a season, the forest would begin reclaiming it. Should the wolves decide that chickens or dogs or even humans are worth the risk of approaching closer, the balance would shift. Morozov understands this implicitly by the time he writes his October 1813 entry understands that his continued presence depends not on his strength or his rights, but on a complex calculus of risk and reward that the wolves perform continuously. They have chosen, so far, not to challenge him directly. This choice could change. Living with that knowledge that safety is never guaranteed, that danger might escalate without warning, requires a particular kind of courage, or perhaps a particular kind of acceptance. Morozov seems to have achieved the latter not through bravery, but through exhaustion and habituation, and a slow wearing down of the expectation that life should feel safe. Safety is relative, contingent, temporary. What remains is attention, vigilance, the steady maintenance of defensive measures, and beneath it all the recognition that one is living on terms set by the landscape rather than imposing terms upon it. This is the wisdom the wolf winter taught, wisdom that comes not as revelation, but as slow accumulation of nights survived, tracks observed, silences interpreted. The journal ends, as we have noted, without drama or conclusion. Life simply continues, recorded in brief practical entries until Morozov stops writing altogether. Perhaps the ledger filled, and he never acquired another. Perhaps the habit of writing faded as years passed, and the experiences that prompted it receded in memory. Perhaps he simply grew too busy or too tired to maintain the practice. We cannot know, and the not knowing is appropriate. Morozov was not a historical figure in any conventional sense, not someone whose life narrative demands completion or whose death requires recording. He was a farmer on the frontier who kept a journal for a few years and then stopped, who lived in one place for 14 years and then moved, who experienced a winter of wolves and adapted to their presence and eventually left them behind when he left that place. His ordinariness is precisely what makes his journal valuable. It shows us how ordinary people confronted extraordinary circumstances, how daily life continued despite fear, how adaptation happened gradually and without heroics. If Morozov's experience was representative, and there is every reason to think it was, then thousands of frontier settlers went through similar winters, similar adaptations, similar transformations in understanding. Most left no record. Morozov did, and his record survives, and through it we can glimpse not just his individual experience, but something of the common experience of frontier life, its tedium and its terror, its isolation and its intimacy with landscape, its demands for patience and endurance and accommodation. The wolves that circled his cabin are long gone, their descendants perhaps still running through forests that are themselves much diminished. The cabin is gone, returned to forest or farmland, or perhaps now site of a different structure entirely. Morozov himself is gone, his life reduced to scattered records: birth, marriage, land purchase, land sale, death, and this journal with its careful entries about firewood and wolves. But the experience the journal describes remains accessible, remains relevant. We still live in landscapes we do not fully control, still encounter forces we cannot predict or manage, still must find ways to function while uncertain and afraid. The specifics change. Wolves have been replaced by other fears, literal darkness by other forms of unknowing. But the fundamental challenge remains: how to live well in a world that does not arrange itself for our comfort or safety. Morozov's answer, developed slowly over that winter and articulated in his final wolf entries, was acceptance without resignation, vigilance without panic, coexistence without illusion. The wolves were his neighbors, neither friends nor enemies, but fellow inhabitants of a landscape that belonged to neither humans nor animals, but simply existed, vast and indifferent, containing multitudes. To live in such a landscape required humility, required recognizing the limits of human control and the provisional nature of human presence. It required learning to distinguish between dangers that could be managed and those that must simply be endured. It required developing new habits of attention new ways of reading signs and interpreting sounds, new capacities for functioning despite chronic low-level fear. Most of all, it required patience, the patience to wait out winter, to let spring arrive in its own time, to trust that the wolves would move on when their purposes were served. This patience, hard-won and thoroughly tested, characterized Morozov's response to the wolf winter and, one suspects, characterized his approach to frontier life more generally. He was not a man in a hurry, not someone seeking quick solutions or dramatic confrontations. He was someone willing to sit by the fire through long nights, to listen without demanding answers, to observe without presuming understanding. This temperament, so different from the heroic frontier persona celebrated in popular narratives, may have been more common than those narratives suggest. Perhaps most successful settlers were people like Morozov, patient, observant, willing to adapt, capable of living with uncertainty and fear without being destroyed by either. If so, then his journal represents not just one man's experience, but a broader truth about frontier life that deserves recognition and respect. The winter of 1811-1812, when wolves came close and taught one man about the limits of human dominion and the possibilities of coexistence, was not unique. But it was documented, preserved and passed down, and now it speaks to us across the distance of 2 centuries. It reminds us that wilderness is not backdrop but presence, that fear can be teacher, that adaptation is achievement, and that the most profound transformations often happen quietly, recorded in spare entries in a worn ledger, noticed only by those who take the time to read carefully and listen to what is said between the lines. Morozov listened to the wolves and learned to hear not just danger, but complexity, not just threat, but life persisting according to its own logic. This listening, patient, sustained, eventually yielding understanding, if not comfort, is perhaps the deepest lesson his journal offers. We are all, in various ways, living at the edge of forests we do not control, hearing calls in the darkness we cannot fully interpret, trying to distinguish between dangers that require action and those that require only acceptance. Morozov shows us one way through: attention without anxiety, vigilance without panic, and beneath it all a fundamental acceptance of the world as it is, rather than as we might wish it to be. The wolves circle and call, we tend our fires and listen. Spring comes eventually, and we mark in our ledgers, if we keep ledgers, the small facts of survival and the large lessons about what it means to share a landscape with forces beyond our understanding or control. Let us drift now into a different kind of inquiry, away from individual experience and toward the larger questions that settlers like Morozov could not answer, questions that remain partially unresolved even today. What were the wolves doing during those long winter nights when they circled cabins, called from the edges of clearings, left tracks that suggested intention without revealing purpose? This is where history becomes archaeology, where written records give way to interpretation, and where the physical evidence, or rather the absence of physical evidence, creates a space for careful speculation. The first mystery is one of documentation itself. When archaeologists excavate frontier settlement sites, they find the usual artifacts of daily life: broken pottery, rusted tools, foundation stones, the post holes where cabins once stood. But they find almost nothing that speaks directly to the experience we've been describing, no physical trace of those winter nights when wolves came close. Fear leaves no artifact. Listening leaves no remains. The nightly vigilance of settlers like Morozov exists only in written accounts, and even those are rare because most frontier families did not keep journals, did not have the literacy or time or inclination to document their internal experiences. What we have are fragments, glimpses, enough to know that something happened, but not enough to fully reconstruct what it meant. Consider what survives and what does not. A wolf's skull might be found near a settlement site, evidence that one was killed and kept as trophy or warning. But the sound of a wolf's howl, how it traveled through winter air, how it resonated differently depending on temperature and humidity and wind direction, how it affected the people who heard it night after night, this exists only in memory and description, and memory fades and descriptions are always incomplete. We know wolves howl. We have recordings now, modern documentation of what these sounds are like, but we cannot know exactly how those howls sounded to someone sitting in a dark cabin in 1811, how the acoustic properties of log walls and shuttered windows altered the sound, how the psychological context of isolation and vulnerability shaped the listening. The experience is lost or nearly lost, retrievable only through careful reading of accounts like Morozov's and the work of imagining our way into a soundscape that no longer exists. There is a branch of archaeology concerned with sensory experience, with trying to understand not just what people did, but what they perceived, how they inhabited their environments through sight and smell and sound. Scholars in this field have studied the acoustics of ancient theatres, the way light moved through temple spaces, the olfactory experience of medieval cities. Some have turned their attention to frontier settlements, using computer modeling and acoustic analysis to understand how sound traveled in these environments. What they've found is that the experience of hearing wolves would have been highly variable depending on countless factors. The density of forest between cabin and wolves would have muffled or clarified the sounds. The temperature of the air would have affected how far sound traveled. Cold air carries sound differently than warm, and the extreme cold of frontier winters would have created acoustic conditions that made distant sounds seem closer, or close sounds seem to come from unexpected directions. The construction of the cabin itself would have filtered the sounds in particular ways. Log walls are thick, but not soundproof. They absorb some frequencies while allowing others to pass through. A wolf howling from 200 yards away might sound like it was just beyond the door, or conversely, a wolf at 50 yards might seem distant and unthreatening. The settlers had no way to verify these perceptions, no method of measuring actual distance, and so they lived with constant uncertainty about how close the danger actually was. This uncertainty was compounded by the nature of wolf vocalizations themselves. Wolves do not howl randomly or without purpose. Modern ethologists, scientists who study animal behavior, have documented that wolf howls serve multiple functions. They help pack members locate each other across distances. They reinforce social bonds within the pack. They communicate territorial boundaries to other wolves. And they coordinate group movements, especially during hunts. But wolves also howl in contexts that remain less understood, situations where the vocalization doesn't seem to serve an obvious practical purpose. Sometimes a wolf howls alone, with no other wolves nearby to answer. Sometimes howling occurs when the pack is stationary, not hunting or traveling. Sometimes the howling includes variations in pitch and rhythm that suggest something more complex than simple communication, something that researchers have hesitantly, almost reluctantly, labeled as possibly expressive, as though wolves might howl partially because the act itself serves some internal function beyond information exchange. If we accept this possibility, and many researchers do, though cautiously, then the wolves circling frontier cabins might have been doing something more complex than threat display or hunger-driven stalking. They might have been announcing their presence, yes, but also listening for responses, testing boundaries, engaging in a kind of acoustic mapping of their territory that included the strange new structures humans had introduced into the landscape. The cabins were, from a wolf's perspective, recent intrusions into a territory that had been theirs for countless generations. The sounds and smells coming from these structures were novel, probably interesting, potentially concerning. The wolves' nightly circuits might have been less about hunting and more about surveillance, about gathering information regarding these new neighbors and deciding how to incorporate them into an existing mental map of the territory. There is evidence for this interpretation in the pattern of wolf behavior documented in frontier accounts. Attacks on humans were extraordinarily rare, much rarer than settlers feared they would be. Most documented wolf attacks involved unusual circumstances, rabid animals, wolves that had been trapped or cornered, situations where the normal behavioral patterns were disrupted by disease or injury. Healthy wolves operating under normal conditions almost never attacked people, even when the people were alone, vulnerable, and presumably easy prey. This suggests that wolves understood humans as dangerous, unpredictable, best avoided or approached with extreme caution. The nightly howling near cabins, then, was probably not prelude to attack, but rather a form of communication. Wolves telling humans, "We are here, we know you are there, these are our boundaries." The fact that settlers like Morozov found this communication terrifying reveals more about human psychology than wolf behavior. But there is another layer to this mystery, one that becomes apparent when we compare wolf behavior in different cultural contexts. Indigenous peoples throughout North America and Northern Asia had been living alongside wolves for thousands of years before European settlers arrived. Their accounts of wolves, preserved in oral traditions, ceremonial practices, and the reports of early anthropologists present a strikingly different picture from the frontier terror we've been describing. In many indigenous cultures, wolves were respected, even revered, but not feared in the way that settlers feared them. Stories describe wolves as teachers, as spirits with particular knowledge, as beings that observed protocols and maintained relationships with human communities based on mutual recognition rather than threat. These weren't naive or romanticized views. Indigenous peoples knew wolves could be dangerous, knew they took game that humans also needed, knew they required careful management and respect. But the relationship was fundamentally different from what settlers experienced, because it was built on generations of coexistence, on learned patterns of behavior that both species understood and followed. When European settlers arrived and built their cabins on the edges of forests, they were entering into a relationship with wolves without this accumulated knowledge, without the cultural frameworks that would have helped them interpret wolf behavior accurately. The wolves approached the cabins because that's what wolves do. They investigate changes in their territory, they test boundaries, they gather information. But the settlers interpreted this behavior through the lens of European folk tales and cultural fears, stories of wolves as monsters, as threats to Christianity, as embodiments of wilderness that had to be destroyed or controlled. The actual wolves at the cabin door and the wolves of cultural imagination became confused, merged into a single entity that was far more frightening than the biological reality justified. This gap between perception and reality is part of what makes the frontier wolf experience a mystery. We have two sets of data that don't quite align. The objective evidence, attacks were rare, wolves generally avoided confrontation, most settlers lived entire winters without any direct threatening contact, suggests that the danger was minimal. But the subjective evidence, the accounts like Morozov's, the fear documented in letters and journals, the psychological toll of constant vigilance, suggests that the experience felt extremely dangerous, that the threat was real even if it was largely psychological. How do we reconcile these two truths? Perhaps by understanding that danger and fear are not the same thing, that one can be genuinely afraid without being in genuine danger, and that this kind of fear has its own validity, its own effects, regardless of whether the threat is objectively present. The settlers were not wrong to be afraid. They were alone in unfamiliar territory, surrounded by sounds they didn't understand, lacking the knowledge that would have helped them interpret what they were hearing. Their fear was a reasonable response to uncertainty, to the recognition that they did not fully control their environment or understand all the forces operating within it. The wolves, meanwhile, were simply being wolves, following patterns of behavior that had served their species for millennia, patterns that included investigating new elements in their territory and maintaining awareness of potential competitors or threats. The tragedy, if we can call it that, is that neither species had the tools to communicate clearly with the other, to establish the kind of mutual understanding that might have reduced the fear and made the coexistence less stressful for both parties. Another aspect of this mystery concerns the physical spacing of settlements and what it reveals about how settlers tried to manage their relationship with wolves and wilderness more broadly. If you look at maps of frontier settlements from the early 19th century, you notice something interesting about how cabins were positioned relative to forest edges. Most settlers chose to build with some cleared space between their cabin and the tree line. 50 yards was common, 100 yards if the terrain allowed it. This clearing served practical purposes. It provided space for gardens and small fields. It reduced the risk of fire spreading from the forest. It made the cabin visible from a distance, so travelers wouldn't pass by unknowingly. But it also served a psychological purpose, creating a buffer zone, a space where settlers could see anything approaching from the woods. That cleared space was a kind of early warning system, a way of buying time and reducing the anxiety of having the forest press immediately against the cabin walls. Yet the wolves negated this buffer by operating primarily at night and by using sound rather than sight as their primary mode of presence. A cleared 100 yards meant nothing when darkness made visibility extend only a few feet beyond the lantern's glow. The wolves could be at the tree line or at the cabin door, and from inside in the dark there was no way to know. The spatial strategies that worked during the day, visibility, cleared fields, sight lines, became useless at night, and the settlers found themselves relying on acoustic information that they couldn't fully interpret. Some settlements tried collective strategies for managing wolf presence. There are accounts of settlers taking turns maintaining watchfires at the center of small clusters of cabins, the theory being that a large fire kept burning through the night would keep wolves at a distance. The archaeological record shows evidence of these fire pits, large, centrally located, filled with more ash than a cooking fire would produce, suggesting sustained use through long periods. But accounts also suggest that these communal fires were difficult to maintain through entire winters. They required enormous amounts of wood, which meant more labor for communities already stretched thin. They required coordination and shared responsibility, which worked well early in winter, but broke down as cold and isolation made people less willing to leave their own cabins for night watch duty. And perhaps most tellingly, the fires didn't actually prevent wolves from coming close. They just changed the dynamics slightly, created a new boundary that wolves learned to respect while still maintaining their presence in the surrounding darkness. By late winter, many settlements had given up on communal fires and returned to individual cabin-based vigilance, each family managing the night in their own way. The mystery deepens when we consider what happened to this knowledge, this hard-won understanding of how to coexist with wolves in winter darkness. As the 19th century progressed, wolf populations in settled areas declined dramatically. Bounties were offered for wolf pelts, hunting campaigns were organized, poison was distributed widely. By the late 1800s, wolves had been effectively eliminated from most frontier regions that had become established settlements. The nightly howling that had been a defining feature of frontier winters for decades gradually faded, became memory, then legend, then forgotten entirely by most people whose families had experienced it directly. What replaced the actual experience of living near wolves was a simplified cultural narrative. Wolves as villains in fairy tales, as symbols of savage wilderness that civilization had rightfully conquered. The complexity of the real relationship, the way settlers like Morozov had learned to listen and interpret and coexist, was lost. Later generations, reading the scared accounts from frontier journals, often interpreted them as evidence of their ancestors' bravery in facing down terrible threats, rather than as evidence of their ancestors' gradual learning process, their slow development of understanding and accommodation. There's a parallel mystery in how wolves themselves adapted to human presence. What they learned about these new neighbors over the decades of close proximity. Modern wolves that live near human populations behave differently from wolves that have never encountered humans. They're more cautious, more nocturnal, better at avoiding direct contact while still moving through territories that humans also inhabit. These behavioral adaptations are learned and transmitted through wolf packs passed from older wolves to younger ones through observation and teaching. The wolves that circled Morozov's cabin in 1811 were part of this learning process. They were figuring out what humans were, what humans did, what level of caution was appropriate. Their circling, their howling, their careful approaches were all forms of information gathering, experiments in understanding these new creatures that had appeared in their territory. And just as Morozov was learning about wolves through his winter of listening, the wolves were learning about humans through their winter of watching. Both species were engaged in the same project, trying to understand the other well enough to predict behavior, avoid conflict, and share space without constant confrontation. That this mutual learning process felt terrifying to the humans involved doesn't negate its function or its eventual effectiveness. By the mid-19th century, in areas where wolf populations still existed, there are accounts suggesting that both wolves and humans had reached a kind of equilibrium. Wolves maintained distance during the day, and settlers tolerated the nightly howling, both parties having learned the boundaries that made coexistence possible. But this equilibrium was short-lived because human populations grew rapidly, and the cultural decision was made that wolves should not exist in settled areas at all, that coexistence was not the goal, and elimination was preferable. We're left then with questions that cannot be fully answered because the evidence exists only in fragments. What exactly were the wolves doing during those winter nights? What information were they gathering? What decisions were they making based on what they heard and smelled and saw? What did human cabins look like in wolf perception? And how did that perception change over time as wolves learned more about human patterns? And from the human side, what was truly lost when wolf howling disappeared from winter nights? Was it only fear that ended, or was there something else, some kind of engagement with wildness, some reminder of human limits, some connection to the larger living world that got severed when the wolves were gone? These are questions we can ask, but not definitively answer. The howling has faded into silence. The wolves have been pushed to remote regions where few people hear them, and the generation that lived through the experiences we've been describing is gone, their direct memories irretrievable. What remains are the accounts they left behind, the archaeological evidence of how they lived, and our own attempts to imagine our way into their experience, to hear through their ears and feel what they felt during those long winter nights when darkness was inhabited by voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, from the edge of safety and the heart of mystery. The wolves themselves remain mysterious, studied extensively by modern science, yet still not fully understood, still capable of behaviors that surprise researchers who have spent decades observing them. They are social and intelligent, adaptable and persistent, shaped by evolutionary pressures. We can trace, but driven by immediate motivations, we can only infer. When we try to understand what happened during those frontier winters, we're really asking about the space between two intelligences, two ways of being in the world, two species that found themselves sharing territory without sharing language or understanding. That space, filled with howling and listening, with fear and curiosity, with misunderstanding and gradual accommodation, is where the mystery lives. It's a space that still exists in the few places where wolves and humans continue to share landscapes, where the old questions remain relevant and the old patterns still play out in modified form. And perhaps it's a space worth remembering and studying, because it teaches us something about how we relate to wildness, to the non-human, to the aspects of the world that don't conform to human plans or respond to human needs. The frontier experience with wolves was not ultimately about triumph or tragedy. It was about proximity, about what happens when two species with their own complex social structures and survival needs find themselves occupying the same ground, listening to each other across the darkness, trying to determine whether the other represents threat or merely presence, danger, or simply otherness. That Morozov eventually came to something like peace with the wolves, that he learned to listen without panic and acknowledge their presence without demanding their absence, suggests that such accommodation is possible even when the initial conditions involve fear and misunderstanding. The wolves, for their part, learned what they needed to learn, that humans were dangerous when threatened, but generally content to remain inside their cabins, that the territory could be shared if boundaries were respected, that the long winter nights were large enough to contain both species without requiring constant conflict. The mystery, then, is not really whether wolves were dangerous or whether settlers were right to fear them. The mystery is how two species managed to coexist during those decades of frontier expansion, how they negotiated a relationship that neither fully controlled, and what was lost when that negotiation ended with the elimination of one party rather than the continuation of mutual adaptation. The archaeology of sound gives us fragments, hints, possibilities. The journals give us emotional truth, subjective experience, the human side of the encounter. The biological evidence gives us facts about wolf behavior, population dynamics, territorial patterns. But between these sources of information lies a gap, a space we cannot fully illuminate, where wolves howled and humans listened, and something happened that we can describe but never completely understand. Perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps some mysteries should remain mysterious, some experiences should resist full explanation, some gaps should remind us that our knowledge has limits and our understanding is always partial. The wolves in the winter darkness circling Morozov's cabin, and 1,000 cabins like it, remain ultimately unknowable in their full reality. We can study their descendants, read the accounts their presence generated, imagine the soundscape of those winter nights, but the lived experience, the actual encounter between specific wolves and specific humans on specific nights in the early 19th century, exists now only as echo, as trace, as story, passed down and recorded and preserved against the forgetting that time imposes on all experience. Let us sit with that uncertainty for a moment. Let us acknowledge that we have reached the edge of what can be known, where evidence fades and speculation begins, where the careful historian must stop and admit that some questions lead into darkness that no amount of research can fully illuminate. The wolves howled, the settlers listened, the winter passed. And now, 2 centuries later, we sit in warm rooms with electric lights and no wolves within 1,000 miles, trying to understand what it meant, what it felt like, why it mattered. The distance is too great, the silence too complete for perfect understanding. But the attempt matters nonetheless because it reminds us that history is not only about what happened, but about what was experienced, not only about events, but about how those events felt to the people who lived through them. And in that space between happening and experiencing, between objective fact and subjective truth, lies the real mystery, the mystery of consciousness itself, of how it feels to be alive in a particular time and place, listening to sounds in the darkness and trying to understand what they mean. Consider for a moment the weight of winter itself, the way it transformed the relationship between wolves and humans into something more intense than it might have been in other seasons. Winter was the crucible in which this encounter was forged, the condition that made everything more immediate, more consequential, more difficult to escape or ignore. In summer or autumn, settlers could venture outside their cabins freely, could work in daylight for long hours, could maintain a kind of mobile vigilance that allowed them to monitor their surroundings while continuing their daily tasks. But winter compressed human activity into smaller spaces and shorter periods, forced people indoors for stretches that could last days when storms made travel impossible, created a claustrophobia that amplified every sound from outside. The wolves, too, were shaped by winter's demands. Their hunting became more difficult as prey animals grew scarce or migrated to lower elevations. Their energy expenditure increased as they moved through deep snow. Their need for calories intensified as cold sapped strength and demanded constant metabolic fuel. Winter made wolves desperate in ways that other seasons did not, pushed them to take risks they might otherwise avoid, brought them closer to human settlements where livestock represented easier meals than the depleted wild game they traditionally hunted. Yet even in this season of scarcity and hardship, even when hunger must have driven them toward the edges of human territory with real urgency, the wolves maintained patterns of behavior that suggested calculation rather than blind need. They came close, yes, but they didn't attack. They circled, they howled, they investigated, but they maintained boundaries that both species seemed to recognize, even if neither fully understood where those boundaries came from or what maintained them. This restraint, this careful approach, even in conditions of stress, speaks to something in wolf nature that the settlers could not have fully appreciated: a capacity for assessment, for weighing risk against reward, for recognizing that humans represented not just potential food or territorial competitors, but a category of being that required special consideration. The wolves were, in their own way, being diplomatic. They were announcing themselves, making their presence known, but doing so in ways that left room for the humans to respond, to establish their own boundaries, to participate in a negotiation that neither species could articulate in language, but both seemed capable of conducting through action and reaction, approach and withdrawal, sound and silence. There were moments, recorded in the more detailed journals that survive, when this negotiation became almost visible. A settler would step outside at dawn, finding wolf tracks circling the cabin at a distance of perhaps 20 yards, never closer, the prints forming a perfect arc that suggested the wolves had walked a predetermined boundary, testing but not crossing some invisible line they themselves had established. The settler would follow these tracks, seeing where they came from the forest edge and where they returned there, and in the pattern of these prints would read a kind of message. We know where you are, we have assessed what you represent, we have decided to maintain this specific distance, and will return tomorrow night to confirm that the arrangement still holds. These tracks became a kind of daily communication, a way for wolves to make their intentions known without requiring direct confrontation. And the settlers, reading these signs, learned their own responses, leaving certain areas near the cabin clear of stored food or valuable items, establishing their own patterns of outdoor activity that the wolves could observe and predict, creating a routine that made both species' behaviors more comprehensible to the other. It was not peace, exactly, but it was something like protocol, a set of understood practices that reduced uncertainty and made the coexistence more manageable. The children born in these frontier cabins, the ones who spent their earliest years listening to wolf howls through long winter nights, developed a relationship with these sounds that was different from their parents' experience. For the adults, the howling was alien, threatening, a reminder of everything they had left behind in coming to this wilderness and everything they still feared about their decision to settle here. But for the children, the howling was simply part of the world as it was, no more strange or frightening than wind in the trees or rain on the roof. A natural phenomenon that marked the passage of night, that signaled certain times and seasons, that became woven into the fabric of ordinary experience. These frontier children grew up with a kind of dual consciousness, absorbing their parents' fear and caution while simultaneously developing their own, more neutral relationship with the sounds that punctuated their nights. When they grew old enough to venture outside after dark, they carried both legacies: the cultural anxiety about wolves that their parents had transmitted, and their own lived experience of hearing these animals for years without ever seeing them attack, without ever witnessing the violence their parents feared. This generational difference in perception created its own dynamics within settlements. Parents who had lived their first winters in constant anxiety might insist on precautions that their teenage children found excessive, leading to conflicts about how seriously to take the wolf presence, how much energy to devote to vigilance and protection. The children had, in their own way, conducted a decades-long experiment in coexistence, living proof that you could grow up within earshot of wolves and survive to adulthood unharmed. But this evidence didn't necessarily reduce their parents' fear, because fear is not always responsive to counter-evidence, especially when it concerns the safety of those we love. The parents had spent too many nights listening in the dark, imagining worst scenarios, feeling the weight of responsibility for protecting their families in an environment they didn't fully understand. That their worst fears had not materialized didn't mean those fears had been irrational at the outset, and it didn't make letting go of those fears any easier now. There's something profound in this generational shift, this movement from fear toward accommodation that happened slowly, incrementally, across the span of childhood and adolescence. It suggests that time itself was a factor in the human-wolf relationship, that the mere passage of years without catastrophe gradually eroded the most extreme anxieties, even if it didn't eliminate concern entirely. The wolves, constant in their nightly presence, became familiar, and familiarity bred not exactly comfort, but at least a kind of acceptance, a recognition that this was how life was lived in this place, that the howling was part of the cost of settlement, something to manage rather than something that required immediate solution or elimination. We should consider, too, the role of livestock in shaping the frontier wolf experience. Many settlers brought animals with them, chickens, pigs, sometimes a cow or horse, creatures that represented significant investment and were crucial to the family's survival and prosperity. These animals complicated the relationship with wolves enormously, creating a more direct and material conflict than the abstract fear of human attack. Wolves did kill livestock, and when they did, the loss was real, and often devastating for families operating at the margin of subsistence. A chicken taken meant fewer eggs, which meant less protein, which meant worse nutrition through the long winter when no other sources of fresh food were available. A pig killed represented not just immediate loss, but the collapse of long-term planning, the destruction of an animal that was supposed to be slaughtered in late fall to provide preserved meat for the entire winter. These livestock losses transformed the wolf from a distant threat to an immediate economic problem, and they generated a kind of anger and resentment that pure fear alone might not have produced. The settlers could, in some way, understand predation on wild animals. That was nature. That was how wolves lived. That was the order of things in a forest ecosystem. But livestock predation felt different, felt like theft or violation, like the wolves were taking something that didn't belong to them, something that humans had invested labor and resources in creating. This sense of violation made coexistence much harder to accept. It pushed settlers toward more aggressive responses, setting traps, organizing hunting parties, lobbying for government bounties that would pay for dead wolves and incentivize their elimination. The presence of livestock, then, escalated the conflict in ways that might not have occurred if the encounter had remained purely one between human dwellers and wild predators operating in separate spheres. And yet even here, there were complexities that don't fit simple narratives. Not all wolves preyed on livestock, and those that did often showed patterns suggesting they were individuals rather than entire packs making this choice. Settlers reported that some winters would pass with no livestock losses despite constant wolf presence, while other winters would see repeated attacks that suggested particular wolves had learned this was an easier food source than hunting wild game. This variability implied that wolves were making individual decisions, that they had different strategies and different levels of boldness when it came to approaching human settlements and taking human-owned animals. The settlers who paid close attention began to distinguish between these individual wolves based on their behavior, gave them names sometimes, tracked which ones were dangerous to livestock and which ones seemed content to hunt in the forest, and simply pass near the cabin without attempting predation. This personalization of the wolf threat, understanding that it wasn't wolves in general, but specific wolves making specific choices, led to more targeted responses. A settler might focus their defensive efforts on particular animals, might set traps in areas where one specific wolf had been seen, might gradually develop an understanding that eliminating one problem individual could restore a workable equilibrium without requiring the extermination of the entire local wolf population. Of course, this nuanced approach required patience, observation skills, and a willingness to engage with wolves as individuals rather than as an undifferentiated threat. Not all settlers were capable of this kind of discrimination, and not all situations allowed for it. Sometimes the pressure was too great, the losses too severe, the fear too overwhelming to permit such careful distinctions. But the fact that some settlers did develop this more sophisticated understanding suggests that the relationship with wolves could have evolved differently, could have moved toward management and selective control rather than wholesale elimination, if conditions had been slightly different, or if the cultural narrative about wolves had been less uniformly hostile. The tragedy is that this potential for nuanced coexistence was ultimately overwhelmed by other factors: the rapid increase in human population, the economic pressures that made livestock losses intolerable, the cultural imperative to conquer wilderness rather than accommodate it, and the technological developments that made wolf elimination feasible in ways it hadn't been during the early frontier period. By mid-century, settlers had access to better firearms, more effective poisons, steel traps that could hold even large wolves, and government programs that provided systematic support for predator elimination. The individual accommodations that settlers like Morozov had worked out with their local wolf populations became irrelevant in the face of coordinated campaigns designed to remove wolves from entire regions. The howling stopped not because humans and wolves had learned to coexist in peace, but because one species gained the technological and numerical advantage necessary to eliminate the other from shared territories. This shift happened remarkably quickly. Within a few decades, regions that had echoed with wolf howls every winter night fell silent. The silence itself became unremarkable as the generation that remembered the howling aged and died, and their children, the ones who had grown up hearing wolves but who now lived in settlements where no wolves remained, failed to pass on the memory to their own children with any emotional weight. Within 2 or 3 generations, the experience of living with wolves became historical curiosity rather than living memory, something to be read about rather than something that shaped daily life and nightly vigilance. And with that transformation, something was indeed lost, not just the wolves themselves, though that loss was real and permanent in most areas, but also the knowledge of how to live alongside large predators, how to read their behavior and respond appropriately, how to maintain boundaries and negotiate shared space with beings that were neither controllable nor eliminable through individual human action. This loss of knowledge matters because it represents a narrowing of human experience, a reduction in the range of relationships we understood how to maintain with the non-human world. The frontier settlers, for all their fear and misunderstanding, were at least engaged in the project of figuring out how to share territory with wolves. They were learning, however imperfectly, how to read signs and interpret sounds, how to predict behavior and respond to threats, how to maintain vigilance without constant panic. Their descendants, living in wolf-free landscapes, lost even the framework for thinking about such relationships, lost the vocabulary and conceptual tools that would have allowed them to imagine coexistence as a possibility worth pursuing. When wolves began to be reintroduced to certain regions in the late 20th century, the human populations in those areas had to relearn everything from scratch, had to rediscover through painful experience what the frontier settlers had figured out through necessity, that wolves are not constantly attacking, that they can be lived with if certain precautions are observed, that their presence in the landscape serves ecological functions that benefit the broader ecosystem, even if it creates challenges for individual humans. This relearning process has been difficult precisely because the knowledge was allowed to lapse, because the cultural memory of coexistence was replaced by cultural memory of wolves as enemies that had to be eliminated. We are still, in many ways, trying to recover what was lost when the howling stopped and the silence became permanent. Let us return, then, to the question of sound, to what it meant to live in a landscape shaped by wolf vocalizations in ways that no modern person in most settled regions can directly experience. The howling created an auditory environment that was fundamentally different from what existed before wolves arrived or after they were eliminated. It marked the night as belonging to other beings, as containing presences and intentions that humans could hear but not see, could respond to but not fully understand. This sonic marking of territory and time created a specific kind of consciousness in the people who lived within it, an awareness that the world beyond the cabin walls was occupied and active, even when invisible, that darkness was not empty, but full of life proceeding according to its own logic and purposes. Modern people, living in landscapes where human sounds dominate or where the sounds of nature have been muted by development and elimination of large predators, rarely experience this kind of auditory awareness. Our nights are filled with mechanical sounds, traffic, appliances, the distant hum of infrastructure, or they are quiet in ways that suggest absence rather than hidden presence. We are not forced to develop the kind of listening skills that Morozov and his contemporaries cultivated, the ability to distinguish between different types of sounds and interpret what they signify about the unseen world producing them. This represents a kind of sensory impoverishment, a narrowing of the range of perceptual engagement with our environments. We have gained comfort, safety, control over our immediate surroundings, but we have lost something in the process, a particular form of attention, a mode of being present in the landscape that required constant openness to signals from the non-human world. The frontier settlers lived with uncertainty and risk, with sounds that kept them alert and anxious through long winter nights, but they also lived with a kind of intimacy with their environment that most of us no longer experience. They knew their landscape through sound in ways that created deep familiarity, even in darkness, could identify individual wolves by the quality of their howls, could predict weather changes by how sound traveled through air of different temperatures and densities. This knowledge was born of necessity, but it produced a sophistication of perception that we have largely lost and rarely even recognize as something worth recovering. Perhaps what the frontier experience with wolves teaches us most clearly is that human comfort and safety often come at the cost of our engagement with complexity, our ability to navigate uncertainty, our capacity to maintain relationships with beings we cannot fully control or understand. The elimination of wolves from settled areas made life easier in many ways, reduced real dangers, eliminated sources of economic loss and psychological stress. But it also simplified the world we inhabit, removed a dimension of experience that required us to be more alert, more skilled in interpretation, more humble about our ability to dominate every aspect of our environment. The silence that replaced the howling is not a neutral absence, but a specific kind of loss, the disappearance of a voice from the world that once shaped how humans understood their place in the larger community of living beings. The wolves circled in the darkness, and in their circling created a form of presence that demanded response, required acknowledgement, refused to allow humans to forget that they were sharing space with other intelligences pursuing their own ends. That presence is gone from most places now, survived only in remote regions and in the recovered memories of those frontier winters when the night belonged to voices calling from the forest edge, when listening was not optional but essential, when the darkness was thick with meanings that humans strained to decipher and never entirely understood. The mystery persists because the evidence is incomplete, the witnesses are gone, and the experience itself resists full translation into the terms we use to make sense of the world. We can study wolf behavior, we can read frontier accounts, we can analyze acoustic properties and psychological responses, but we cannot fully reconstitute what it felt like to be inside that experience, to live it night after night, with no certainty about when or whether it would end. The gap between knowing about something and experiencing it directly cannot be bridged by any amount of historical research or scientific analysis. What we're left with is approximation, educated imagination, the attempt to hear echoes of something that has fallen silent. This is the work of historical recovery, and it's important work despite its limitations, because it helps us understand what was lost and what that loss means for how we live now. The winter nights when wolves howled around frontier cabins were not just events in the past, but turning points in how humans related to the natural world, moments when the possibility of coexistence was tested and ultimately abandoned in favor of elimination and control. That we might have chosen differently, that the relationship might have evolved toward sustained negotiation rather than one-sided victory, becomes clear only in retrospect, only when we look back and see the paths not taken, the possibilities that were foreclosed by decisions made in fear and frustration and economic pressure. The wolves themselves have no voice in this historical record except as it was mediated through human perception and interpretation. We cannot know what they thought about the strange structures appearing in their territories, what decisions they made individually or as packs about how to respond to human presence, what information they passed to their offspring about these new and dangerous neighbors. The wolf perspective remains inaccessible except through inference and projection, through our attempts to imagine what their world looked like from inside their own experience. This limitation reminds us that history is always partial, always told from particular positions, always missing vast stretches of experience that never get recorded or preserved. For every Morozov who wrote about his winter with wolves, there were hundreds of settlers who lived through similar experiences and left no written trace, whose feelings and thoughts and adaptations are simply lost to us now. And for every human account, there are the uncountable wolf experiences, the individual animals who encountered humans, made decisions about them, learned from them, and carried that knowledge through seasons and years until they died and the knowledge died with them. The full story of those frontier winters involves thousands of individual consciousnesses, human and wolf, all navigating uncertainty and trying to make sense of each other across the species boundary. We have access to tiny fragments of this larger story, and from these fragments we try to construct understanding, knowing that vast portions will forever remain unknown. This humility about what we can know should not lead to despair about the historical project itself, but should rather shape how we approach these questions, with appropriate caution about our conclusions and appropriate respect for the complexity of what actually happened. The settlers and the wolves were both doing their best to survive and to understand a situation neither had chosen, and the fact that this mutual effort ultimately failed to produce lasting coexistence tells us something about the forces, cultural, economic, technological, that constrain even well-intentioned attempts to live with wildness. Consider now the physical remains that do survive from this period, the material traces that archaeologists can still examine and interpret. The cabin sites themselves, when excavated carefully, reveal patterns in how space was organized and used during those winter months when wolf presence shaped daily life. The placement of sleeping areas, for instance, often shows evidence of thought given to which walls faced the forest and which faced cleared areas. Families preferred to sleep against walls that had the most open ground beyond them. the theory being that anything approaching from that direction would be more easily heard or would trigger alert from dogs or other animals. Storage areas for food were typically located in portions of cabins furthest from doors and windows, reducing the scent trails that might attract wolves and creating additional barriers between any intruder and the resources the family depended upon for survival. These spatial arrangements represent solutions to specific problems, evidence of how settlers adapted their living patterns to accommodate the threat they perceived from beyond their walls. The remains of defensive structures, reinforced doors, shutters with heavy crossbars, the occasional gun port cut through log walls, speak to the lengths some families went to create physical barriers between themselves and the night. But these same sites also show evidence of normal daily life continuing despite the fear, evidence of children's toys and women's needlework, and men's craft projects undertaken during long winter evenings. The settlers were not paralyzed by their fear, but rather incorporated it into their routines, maintained vigilance while also maintaining the domestic activities that gave structure and meaning to their existence. This balancing act between awareness of danger and commitment to ordinary life, between fear of what lurked in darkness and determination to build something lasting in this landscape, characterizes the frontier experience in ways that simple narratives of heroism or terror cannot capture. The settlers were neither fearless pioneers conquering wilderness nor terrified victims cowering before nature's power, but rather ordinary people trying to manage complex emotions and uncertain situations while going about the practical work of survival and settlement. The wolf howls were part of the context in which they lived, but not the only part, or even necessarily the dominant part. There were also crops to plan for, tools to repair, children to teach, neighbors to visit when weather permitted, seasons to track, and futures to imagine beyond the immediate challenges of each winter night. In this sense, the frontier experience with wolves was ultimately about integration, about how people incorporated extraordinary circumstances into the framework of ordinary existence, how they normalized what was initially terrifying and found ways to continue living meaningful lives despite ongoing uncertainty. This process of normalization is visible in the changing tone of journals and letters written by long-term frontier residents. Early entries express shock and fear at wolf howling, describe sleepless nights and constant anxiety, frame the wolf presence as an existential threat that dominates consciousness. But later entries from the same writers, sometimes just months or a year later, mention the howling almost casually, note wolf presence as one among many factors in their daily planning, describe hearing wolves without feeling compelled to document their emotional response because that response has become routine, no longer worthy of special comment. This shift from dramatic reaction to matter-of-fact acknowledgement suggests that humans are remarkably adaptable, capable of incorporating almost any circumstance into the category of normal if exposed to it long enough without catastrophic outcome. The wolves, by being present but not actively harmful most of the time, allowed this normalization to occur, and in doing so they may have secured their own temporary coexistence with humans better than if they had remained completely absent or had been more aggressively threatening. A threat that never materializes eventually loses its emotional power, becomes background rather than foreground, and while this didn't save the wolves from eventual elimination, it did allow for a period of decades when both species occupied the same territories with some degree of mutual adaptation. There's something poignant in this, in recognizing that wolves and humans did find a way to live alongside each other, even if that arrangement proved temporary, even if it was built more on mutual wariness than mutual understanding. For those decades of uneasy coexistence, the frontier was truly a borderland, a place where two different ways of being in the world intersected and influenced each other, where neither species could fully claim dominance or security, where night and winter and darkness created conditions that leveled the playing field and required both parties to acknowledge the other's presence and power. The memory of this borderland period, when it's remembered at all, tends to be simplified into narratives about human conquest or ecological destruction. But the actual experience was more complex and more interesting than these simplified versions suggest. It was a time when boundaries were negotiated rather than dictated, when outcome was uncertain, when the presence of large predators in the landscape forced humans to remain alert and adaptive in ways that shaped frontier culture and character in profound ways. The elimination of wolves changed not just the ecological dynamics of settled regions, but also the psychological and cultural dynamics of human communities that no longer had to maintain vigilance against predation or navigate the complex soundscape of wolf vocalizations. The landscape became simpler, safer, more fully human-dominated, and in becoming these things it lost dimensions of meaning and experience that had been integral to frontier life. Whether this trade-off was worth making remains a question without simple answers, because it involves weighing incommensurable values, human safety, and economic security against ecological complexity and experiential richness, the peace of mind that comes with eliminating threats against the particular form of aliveness that comes from living in proximity to powerful non-human beings. Different people will answer this question differently depending on their values and priorities, and perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps there is no single correct answer, but rather a recognition that choices were made, that those choices had consequences both positive and negative, and that understanding what was lost helps us make better choices now when similar questions arise in different contexts. The frontier experience with wolves cannot be repeated. Too much has changed, the wilderness has been too thoroughly settled, the wolves themselves have been reduced to remnant populations in most areas. But the questions that experience raised remain live questions. How do we share space with beings we cannot fully control? How do we maintain relationships with the non-human world that go beyond pure domination or exploitation? How do we live with uncertainty, with sounds in the darkness, with presences that we cannot fully understand or predict? These questions matter now as much as they did in Morozov's time, even if the specific circumstances have changed, even if the wolves themselves are mostly gone from the landscapes where our daily lives unfold. The lessons of those winter nights about attention, about adaptation, about the limits of human control and understanding remain relevant to how we think about our place in the larger community of living beings. The howling has stopped. The darkness is no longer inhabited by voices calling from the forest edge, and we live in a world where most people will never experience what Morozov experienced during that long winter of listening. But the memory persists, preserved in fragments, available to those who care to seek it out and try to understand what it meant. And in that memory lies a kind of inheritance, a legacy of experience that can inform how we think about wilderness and wildness, about fear and accommodation, about the costs of safety and the value of maintaining relationships with aspects of the world that resist our categories and defy our control. The wolves were there at the edge of the clearing, calling through the winter darkness. The settlers were inside, listening, trying to understand, slowly learning to live with uncertainty and presence. This encounter, brief in historical terms but profound in its implications, shaped both species in ways we're still uncovering, still trying to comprehend fully. And the questions it raises about coexistence, about perception, about fear and adaptation, and the space between different forms of consciousness remain with us still, waiting for new answers, calling from whatever darkness we haven't yet learned to navigate or understand. The mystery endures because the experience itself was mysterious, because it touched on fundamental questions about what it means to be human in a world we don't fully control, to be alive in a landscape inhabited by other beings pursuing their own purposes. The frontier winters when wolves howled around cabins were not exceptional moments, but rather clarifying ones. times when the usual illusions of human dominance fell away, and what remained was the raw fact of shared existence, of multiple intelligences occupying the same ground and trying to figure out what that meant. We are still, in many ways, engaged in that same project, still trying to figure out how to live on a planet we share with countless other forms of life. The wolves have mostly fallen silent, pushed to the margins, but the questions they raised by their presence remain at the center of how we think about our relationship with the natural world. And perhaps that is the true legacy of those frontier encounters, not the elimination of wolves or the conquest of wilderness, but the reminder that we are always in relationship with forces larger than ourselves, always listening to sounds we don't fully understand, always living in darkness that contains presences we can sense but never completely comprehend. The howling taught Morozov something about humility, about the limits of human knowledge and control, about the value of learning to listen without demanding full understanding. That lesson, preserved across 2 centuries in the fragmentary records of frontier experience, remains worth learning, worth carrying forward into whatever future awaits us. The wolves may be gone from most of our landscapes, but their voices echo still in the spaces where we pause to listen, where we acknowledge what we don't know, where we recognize that the world is larger and stranger and more full of mystery than our daily routines usually allow us to perceive. Let us turn now to a different kind of winter, experienced by different people in different circumstances, where wolves existed but at a remove, where the night held other concerns and the howling, if heard at all, was filtered through layers of privilege and protection that fundamentally altered its meaning. Not everyone who lived through these winters faced the darkness in the same way. While settlers like Morozov pressed their ears against cabin walls and tracked wolf movements through sound and snowprints, there were others, landowners, government officials, military officers, established merchants, who experienced winter from positions of relative safety and comfort. Their winters were no less cold, the nights no less long, but the relationship to danger was mediated by distance, by architecture, by the presence of others whose job it was to worry about wolves on their behalf. Consider the estate of a provincial administrator in the Northern Territories, a man we'll call Konstantin Ivanovich Volkov, whose position afforded him a stone house rather than a log cabin, whose property extended across cleared lands that pushed the forest back a quarter-mile from his residence. His house stood 2 stories tall, with proper foundations dug below the frost line, with multiple rooms that could be closed off from each other to conserve heat, with windows of actual glass rather than oiled paper or wooden shutters. The walls were thick enough that external sounds reached the interior only faintly, as suggestion rather than immediate presence. When Volkov sat in his study on a winter evening, a fire burning in a properly constructed fireplace with a chimney that drew efficiently, he might hear wind but little else. The night existed outside his windows as a visual phenomenon, darkness visible through glass, but not as an acoustic environment that demanded his attention. If wolves called from the distant tree line, the sound would have to travel across open ground, through cold air, past the outer buildings where servants and stable hands lived, through the stone walls, before reaching his ears as something so faint it might be mistaken for wind or imagination. This distance was not accidental. The wealthy and powerful had learned over generations how to structure their relationship with wilderness. Their homes were positioned not just for convenience or aesthetic pleasure, but for security. Cleared land around the main house served agricultural purposes, yes, but also created a buffer zone, a space where anything approaching could be seen during daylight hours and where sound would dissipate before becoming truly disturbing. The forest was kept at a deliberate distance, managed as a resource, timber harvested from controlled sections, game hunted at designated times, but never allowed to press close enough to become a source of daily anxiety. Volkov's household included staff whose responsibilities included managing the boundary between civilization and wilderness. Gamekeepers patrolled the property during daylight, noting signs of wolf activity, reporting any movement that seemed to be trending toward the main buildings. Stable hands secured livestock each evening in stone structures with proper doors and locks, buildings that wolves could not easily breach, even if they were inclined to try. Night watchmen made rounds through the early evening hours, carrying lanterns and sometimes accompanied by large dogs bred specifically for guarding property rather than herding or hunting. These were not the lean, nervous animals that accompanied frontier settlers. These were mastiffs and similar breeds, imposing in size and temperament, trained to bark at anything unusual, but also trained to remain calm unless directly threatened. The presence of these animals changed the acoustic environment significantly. If wolves approached the property, the dogs would alert long before the wolves came close enough to trouble the main house, and the staff would respond, building up fires, making noise, demonstrating that the property was actively defended rather than passively occupied. The result was that people like Volkov rarely heard wolves directly. They heard about wolves from reports delivered by staff, from letters sent by frontier administrators, from conversations with other landowners about conditions in the outer territories, but the actual lived experience of wolf presence remained abstract, something that happened elsewhere to other people. Winter, for the wealthy, was primarily a season of isolation rather than immediate danger. The challenges they faced were social and logistical rather than visceral. Roads became impassable, which meant visitors were rare and correspondence was delayed. Supply lines stretched thin, which meant they had to rely on stores laid up in autumn, but these stores were extensive, carefully planned, including luxuries that frontier families could not imagine. Root cellars beneath stone houses could maintain stable temperatures through the coldest months, preserving food more effectively than the crude storage methods available to settlers. Meat could be smoked or salted in dedicated outbuildings designed for preservation with proper ventilation and protection from pests and scavengers. The wealthy winter diet was limited compared to summer abundance, but remained varied and nutritious. Preserved fruits, pickled vegetables, smoked fish, cured meats, hard cheeses that improved with age, dried mushrooms and herbs, honey, nuts stored in sealed containers. Malnutrition was rare. Scurvy, the scourge of frontier winters when vitamin sources ran low, was prevented through access to preserved fruits and the knowledge required to maintain nutritional balance. The interior spaces of wealthy winter residences revealed the extent of their separation from the concerns that dominated settler life. Multiple rooms meant that heating could be managed more efficiently. Some rooms kept warm through constant use, others closed off and allowed to cool, opened only when needed. This spatial luxury meant that daily life could maintain some variation, some movement between different environments and activities, rather than the enforced compression of frontier cabins where everything happened in one small space. Volkov's study contained books, not just ledgers and practical manuals, but literature, history, philosophy, which meant that winter evenings could be spent in intellectual activity rather than just waiting for dawn. Reading by proper candlelight or oil lamps, with enough fuel to burn through multiple hours without anxiety about waste, transformed the long dark hours from something to be endured into something that could be almost enjoyed. Some wealthy households maintained music as part of their winter routine. A piano or harpsichord, sheet music, voices trained well enough to carry melody. These created an acoustic environment that filled the silence with human intention, that pushed back against the emptiness of winter nights through deliberate sound production. When wolves howled in the distance, they did so beneath or behind or around the edges of human music, their wildness contained within a larger soundscape dominated by civilization. The psychological effect of this containment should not be underestimated. For settlers, the night belonged to the wolves. Human activity dimmed to nearly nothing after darkness fell. and whatever sounds emerged from beyond the cabin walls carried weight and significance because they were the primary acoustic events in an otherwise silent environment. For the wealthy, the night remained more under human control. Conversations continued, music played, feet moved across wooden floors, doors opened and closed, fires crackled, all creating a baseline of human noise that declared the space as fundamentally domestic, civilized, safe. Wolves might exist beyond the walls, but they existed as distant phenomena, no more immediately concerning than weather or astronomical events, things to be aware of, but not things that demanded constant vigilance. This difference in experience created a profound gap in understanding between the classes. When Volkov read reports from frontier administrators about wolf problems, about settlers requesting assistance or military intervention, he processed this information without the visceral knowledge that would have made it emotionally resonant. He understood wolves as a management problem, something requiring policy decisions and resource allocation, but not as a source of personal fear or nightly anxiety. His decisions about wolf bounties, about how much governmental support to provide to frontier settlements, were made from a position of comfortable detachment, informed by abstract principles rather than lived experience. This detachment extended to how the wealthy talked about wolves among themselves. In their letters and diaries, wolves appear as elements in stories, as topics of conversation, as symbols in discussions about the challenges of territorial expansion and the character traits required for frontier life. There's a literary quality to these mentions, a sense that wolves are being discussed as concepts rather than immediate physical presences. "The wolves have been troublesome this winter," one landowner might write to another, the word troublesome carrying no more emotional weight than it would in a comment about persistent rain or unexpected expenses. Some wealthy households kept wolf pelts as decorations or status symbols, furs displayed on walls or used as floor coverings, physical evidence of wolves that had been killed and transformed into objects of aesthetic appreciation. These pelts represented a complete inversion of the frontier relationship with wolves. Where settlers feared wolves as living threats, the wealthy could admire them as dead ornaments, their danger neutralized and their bodies repurposed for human comfort and display. The skins became conversation pieces, stories attached to their acquisition, a hunting expedition, a particularly troublesome wolf that had been causing problems until finally tracked and killed, the skill of the hunter or the cunning required to trap the animal. The wolves in these stories were antagonists that had been overcome, problems that had been solved, never ongoing sources of nightly concern that shaped the rhythm of domestic life. Winter social life among the wealthy, when it could be maintained despite travel difficulties, often included discussions about frontier conditions, about the challenges faced by settlers and the proper role of government in managing territorial expansion. These conversations had a theoretical quality, debates about abstract principles rather than practical problems requiring immediate solutions. Should the government offer greater incentives to encourage settlement in difficult regions? Should military resources be devoted to wolf eradication programs? Were settlers who complained about wolves demonstrating insufficient fortitude for frontier life, or were their complaints legitimate and deserving of support? These questions were discussed over dinner in warm rooms by candlelight, with wine and multiple courses of food, while outside the windows the winter night pressed against the glass and wolves, if they were present at all, remained invisible and silent at the edges of cleared land. The gap between these comfortable discussions and the reality of frontier life was enormous, unbridgeable. Yet it's important to note that the wealthy were not entirely insulated from winter's harshness or from the reality of wolves. They faced their own challenges, experienced their own forms of isolation and anxiety, even if these differed fundamentally from what frontier families endured. The darkness affected them too, the short days and long nights that persisted, regardless of wealth or position. Seasonal depression, what would later be recognized as a real psychological condition triggered by lack of sunlight, touched wealthy and poor alike. The feeling of being cut off, separated from the larger world by snow and impassable roads, created its own psychological weight. Letters from family members in distant cities might not arrive for months, leaving people uncertain about whether loved ones were well or in trouble, alive or dead. Business concerns could not be addressed in real time. Decisions that should have been made in weeks stretched to months. Opportunities might be missed. Problems might compound while communication remained impossible. The wealthy worried about different things than settlers worried about, but they still worried, still felt the pressure of winter's constraints. Some wealthy individuals seem to have been aware of this gap between their experience and that of frontier families. Their private writings occasionally reveal moments of reflection, recognition that their comfort was built on privileges not available to others. Volkov, in a letter to a friend written in February 1815, describes visiting a frontier settlement to inspect conditions and report back to his superiors. He arrived during late afternoon, as daylight was fading, and was offered shelter in a settler's cabin for the night, rather than attempting to return home in darkness. His description of that night is revealing. He writes of being unable to sleep, disturbed by sounds that the family seemed to accept as normal. The creaking of logs, the wind moving around the cabin, and most notably, the howling of wolves that seemed far closer than he had ever experienced at his own residence. I understood for the first time, he writes, why the settlers speak of wolves with such concern. In my house, with stone walls and distance, they are abstractions. Here, with only logs and 50 yards of clearing, they are presences that demand attention. I did not sleep more than an hour that night, and I found myself grateful when dawn arrived and I could return home. I have new respect for those who endure this nightly, and I am less confident in my previous judgments about their fortitude or lack thereof. This moment of awareness, however genuine, remained exceptional. Most wealthy landowners never spent nights in frontier cabins, never directly experienced the acoustic reality of wolves calling from nearby tree lines, never felt the particular quality of fear that comes from being separated from potential danger by only a thickness of logs and a barred door. Their relationship to wolves remained mediated by distance and structure, filtered through reports and stories rather than direct encounter. The children of wealthy families grew up with a completely different understanding of winter and wolves than frontier children. They heard stories, certainly. Nurses and tutors who came from less privileged backgrounds might share tales of wolves, either to frighten or to educate. But these stories existed in the same category as fairy tales and myths, narratives disconnected from daily reality. When these children looked out winter windows, they saw snow and trees at a distance, not threats pressing close. Their education about wolves came from books and descriptions rather than from nightly listening, from intellectual knowledge rather than experiential learning. This created generational patterns where wealthy families maintained their comfortable relationship with winter across multiple generations, each inheriting not just property and position, but also a particular way of experiencing or not experiencing the wildness beyond their walls. As the 19th century progressed and wolf populations declined in response to systematic eradication campaigns, the gap between wealthy and poor experience of wolves narrowed, but only because wolves themselves were disappearing. Frontier families eventually achieved through absence what the wealthy had always enjoyed through distance: nights without howling, winters without the constant awareness of wolf presence. But this achievement came with its own complications and losses, as we have discussed. The wealthy, who had contributed to wolf eradication through bounty programs and policy decisions, rarely reflected on what was being lost, because they had never possessed it to begin with. Their relationship with wolves had always been abstract, mediated, theoretical, and its ending required no adjustment in their daily lives or nightly routines. There is something troubling about this disparity, something that speaks to larger patterns in how different social classes experience frontier expansion and territorial settlement. The wealthy made decisions that affected frontier life, where settlements would be established, what support they would receive, how resources would be allocated, but they made these decisions from positions of comfort and safety that bore little resemblance to the conditions they were managing. The settlers, meanwhile, lived with the consequences of these decisions directly, their nights shaped by policies crafted in warm studies by people who had never listened to wolves calling from the darkness beyond inadequate walls. This pattern repeated across numerous aspects of frontier life, not just wolves. The wealthy experienced wilderness as a resource to be managed and exploited from a distance. The poor experienced it as an immediate environment that had to be negotiated daily, that surrounded and contained their lives, that could not be dismissed or ignored. When policy discussions turned to questions about how to handle predators, how to encourage settlement, how to transform wilderness into productive territory, the voices with most influence belonged to those with least direct experience, while those with most experience had least influence over the decisions being made. Yet we should be careful not to oversimplify this dynamic or to romanticize frontier hardship while demonizing elite comfort. The wealthy households, with their stone walls and cleared lands, their staff and resources, represented what most frontier families hoped eventually to achieve. Not necessarily wealth on that scale, but some measure of security, some distance from immediate danger, some ability to experience winter as inconvenience rather than constant threat. The settlers were building toward a future that looked more like elite experience and less like their own present circumstances. Their children, if all went according to plan, would grow up in larger houses on more secure properties, would have better protection from cold and from predators, would look back on their parents' frontier years as a difficult time that had been successfully overcome. The elite, then, represented not just an alternative experience of winter, but also an aspirational future, a model of what successful settlement could eventually create. The disparity was not only about current conditions, but also about the timeline of security and comfort. The wealthy already lived in the future that settlers were working toward. This temporal dimension complicates any simple moral judgment about the different winter experiences. In time, most settled regions did indeed achieve something resembling the security that the wealthy had always enjoyed. Wolves were eliminated or pushed to remote regions, settlements grew into towns with better infrastructure and collective resources. Individual cabins were replaced by more substantial homes with improved construction. The progression from frontier anxiety to settled security took decades, sometimes generations, but it did generally move in that direction. The cost of this progression, however, was paid primarily by those who lived through the difficult early years and by the wolves themselves, whose elimination was treated as a necessary step in the civilization process. The wealthy facilitated and benefited from this progression without experiencing most of its costs, a pattern that characterized much of frontier expansion. There's a final observation worth making about how winter was experienced across class lines. The wealthy, with their books and music and varied rooms and extensive stores of food, could treat winter as a season with its own pleasures and opportunities. Forced isolation could be reframed as opportunity for focused work, for reading and reflection, for the kind of sustained attention that busy summer seasons did not allow. The long evenings could be social occasions, gatherings of nearby families who could afford to travel even in difficult conditions, parties that lasted through the night because no one wanted to begin a cold journey home in darkness. Winter balls, held in great houses with multiple fireplaces and enough candles to approximate daylight, became anticipated events, something to plan for and remember bright points in the dark season. For frontier families, winter offered no such compensations. It was simply something to survive, a season that had to be endured rather than enjoyed, that restricted rather than enabled, that took rather than gave. The darkness was not an aesthetic experience, but a practical problem. The cold was not invigorating, but dangerous. The isolation was not peaceful, but anxious. There were no winter balls in frontier cabins, no pleasant evenings of reading and music, only the nightly routine of fire tending and listening, waiting for dawn and hoping that spring would arrive before resources ran out. This fundamental difference in how winter could be experienced and interpreted, as opportunity or threat, as season with compensating beauties or as unremitting hardship, reveals more than just economic disparity. It reveals how thoroughly privilege shapes perception, how the same external conditions can generate completely different internal experiences depending on the resources and protections available to mediate them. Two people might look at the same winter landscape, the same dark forest, the same snow-covered ground and see entirely different things, one seeing beauty and romantic sublimity, the other seeing danger and desperate isolation. Neither perception is wrong exactly, but they emerge from such different positions that they might as well be observing different seasons entirely. As winter progressed toward spring, these different experiences converged slightly. Everyone, regardless of wealth or position, felt relief when days began to lengthen, when the grip of cold started to loosen, when the possibility of movement and connection returned. The wealthy emerged from their comfortable isolation ready to resume normal activities, having weathered the season successfully with minimal disruption. The frontier settlers emerged having survived something rather more demanding, having spent months in a state of vigilance and anxiety that left marks not easily erased. Volkov returned to his administrative duties, processed reports, made decisions about resource allocation for the coming year. Morozov returned to his fields, began the work of planting and repair, tried to catch up on all the maintenance that had been deferred through the winter months. Both men would face another winter eventually, would watch darkness descend and cold arrive, would settle into their respective winter routines. But they would do so from such different positions, with such different resources and protections, that their winters remained fundamentally incomparable, even though they occurred in the same geographic region during the same calendar months. The wolves, for their part, treated all humans as essentially similar, sources of uncertainty and potential danger, beings to be observed and avoided, presences that required caution regardless of whether they lived in stone houses or log cabins. The wolves did not distinguish between wealthy and poor, did not adjust their behavior based on human social status. They responded to immediate factors, the presence of dogs, the smell of livestock, the sounds and lights that indicated human activity. In this way, wolves were more democratic than the human society they encountered, treating all people as members of the same category, all equally strange and worthy of careful attention. But the humans did not return this democratic perspective. They remained divided by their different experiences, their different relationships to winter and wildness, their different abilities to create distance and safety. And these divisions persisted long after individual winters ended, became embedded in policy and culture, shaped how frontier expansion proceeded and who benefited most from the transformation of wilderness into settled territory. The story of winter wolves, then, is not just about the relationship between humans and animals, between settlers and predators. It is also about the relationships among humans themselves, about how social hierarchies shape experience and understanding, about who faces danger directly and who manages it from comfortable distance, about whose fears are validated and whose are dismissed as weakness. These questions remain relevant long after the wolves have gone silent, long after the frontier has disappeared into history, long after winter nights have been tamed by electric lights and central heating, and the near-total elimination of wildness from settled landscapes. The disparities persist in new forms, the patterns repeat in different contexts, and the basic dynamic, some people experiencing danger directly, while others make decisions about it from positions of safety, continues to structure human relationships with the non-human world. Let us hold this awareness gently as we move toward the close of our journey through these winter nights. The wealthy in their stone houses, the settlers in their log cabins, the wolves in the dark forest, all were participants in a historical moment that has passed, all played roles in a transformation that could not have proceeded without all of them. Their different experiences do not cancel each other out, but rather reveal the complexity of any historical moment, the way that single events or seasons contain multiple realities depending on who is experiencing them and from what position. Winter came for everyone. But how it felt, what it meant, what it demanded, these varied enormously, and these variations matter if we want to understand not just what happened, but what it was like, how it felt, what it cost those who lived through it in its various forms. And so we arrive at the end of our quiet journey through those winter nights when wolves came close, when darkness was not empty but inhabited, when the hours between sunset and dawn required vigilance and listening, and a kind of courage that left no monuments, no grand narratives, only the small, persistent record of people enduring what needed to be endured. Let us rest here for a moment, at this threshold between past and present, and consider what we have traveled through together. We began with the immediate, visceral experience of a single winter night in a frontier cabin. The sounds and silences, the fear that was not panic, but sustained awareness, the way darkness transformed familiar landscapes into territories of uncertainty. We felt the weight of the barred door, heard the howling drift across snow-covered clearings, understood how night after night of vigilance could reshape a person's relationship to their own home, to safety itself. Then we followed Yakov Petrovich Morozov through his winter of 1811 and 1812, watching through his careful journal entries as he moved from casual notation to sustained attention to something approaching understanding. His words showed us that accommodation was possible, that fear could transform into awareness without disappearing entirely, that humans and wolves could share winter darkness in a relationship built not on conquest, but on mutual recognition and carefully maintained distance. We drifted next into the realm of mystery and unanswered questions, into the archaeology of sound and the gaps in our knowledge about what those encounters truly meant. We explored how wolves might have perceived the strange new structures in their territory, how sound traveled through winter air in ways that amplified uncertainty, how indigenous peoples and European settlers brought entirely different frameworks to the same animal encounters, creating different realities from the same physical circumstances. Finally, we turned our attention to those who experienced winter from positions of protection and privilege, whose nights passed in stone houses behind cleared lands, whose relationship to wolves remained abstract and mediated, whose decisions shaped frontier life without requiring them to endure its daily realities. We saw how the same season, the same darkness, the same wolves could generate entirely different experiences depending on resources and social position, how winter democracy extended only so far before human hierarchies reasserted themselves. These four perspectives, immediate experience, individual narrative, cultural mystery, and social disparity, together form a more complete picture than any single viewpoint could provide. They show us that historical moments are never simple, never unified, always containing multiple truths that coexist without necessarily reconciling. The winter nights when wolves came close meant different things to different people, generated different fears and different adaptations, left different marks on those who lived through them. Now, from our contemporary vantage point, we can look back across 2 centuries and recognize how much has changed. The wolves that troubled Morozov's sleep are gone from most settled regions, eliminated through systematic campaigns that treated their eradication as progress, as necessary advancement in the civilizing process. The frontier itself has disappeared, those liminal zones where wilderness and settlement met and negotiated their boundaries, replaced by landscapes so thoroughly humanized that the idea of wild spaces pressing close to domestic ones seems almost fantastical. The darkness that once felt inhabited and dangerous has been tamed by electric light, street lamps and porch lights, and the ambient glow of cities that push back the night so effectively that most people now live their entire lives without ever experiencing true darkness, the kind of darkness that Morozov knew that required adjustment and patience and left room for imagination and fear. We have achieved what the settlers worked toward: safety, security, distance from predators and from the uncomfortable awareness of our own vulnerability. Our homes are heated reliably, lit at the touch of a switch, connected to the wider world through technologies that make isolation nearly impossible. We can learn about wolves through documentaries and nature programs, can observe them from safe distances in controlled environments, can appreciate their beauty and ecological importance without ever hearing them howl outside our bedroom windows in the depth of winter night. This is, by most measures, an improvement. Few people would willingly trade contemporary comfort for the anxious vigilance of frontier winters. The elimination of constant low-grade fear from domestic life represents genuine progress in human well-being, liberation from constraints that our ancestors endured out of necessity rather than choice. We should not romanticize their hardship or pretend that there was something noble about sleeping lightly while listening for wolves, about spending winter nights in states of sustained alertness that left people exhausted and anxious. And yet, as we lie here in our warm beds in our quiet rooms where the only sounds are the hum of heating systems and the distant white noise of civilization, perhaps we can acknowledge that something was also lost in this transformation. Not the fear itself, we are right to be glad that fear is gone. But perhaps the awareness that the fear generated, the recognition that we are not the only inhabitants of the world, that our comfort and safety are not natural givens, but achievements that required effort and came at cost to other species and to aspects of the world that existed before human dominance became so complete. Morozov, lying awake in his cabin, listening to wolves circle in the darkness, was more aware than we typically are of his place in a larger ecology. He knew in a visceral way that most of us now only understand intellectually that humans are animals among other animals, that our survival depends on constant negotiation with forces we do not fully control, that the boundary between safety and danger is thinner than we like to imagine. This awareness was uncomfortable, certainly, but it was also accurate, a truth about existence that remains true even when we have successfully insulated ourselves from its daily pressure. The wolves are mostly gone now, but the relationship they represented, the relationship between human aspiration for control and the persistent wildness of the world, has not fundamentally changed. We have simply moved the boundary, pushed the wild spaces farther from our homes, made the negotiations less immediate and obvious. But we remain participants in ecological systems we do not fully understand, remain vulnerable in ways we prefer not to acknowledge, remain animals whose comfort depends on structures and systems that could, under the right circumstances, prove less permanent than they currently feel. There is something valuable in occasionally remembering this, in allowing ourselves to imaginatively return to those frontier cabins and feel what Morozov felt, not because we want to recreate his fear, but because the perspective it provided remains relevant even in our changed circumstances. When we think about how to live on a planet undergoing rapid environmental change, about how to share space with the non-human world, about what we owe to species we have displaced or eliminated, perhaps that old frontier awareness of mutual presence and careful boundaries could inform our thinking in useful ways. The winter nights we have explored together are gone, irretrievable except through imagination and the fragmentary records that survived. But they are not irrelevant. They speak to something about human experience that transcends their specific historical moment, about how we manage fear, about how we adapt to circumstances we cannot change, about the slow process of learning to coexist with what we do not fully understand, about the way sustained attention can transform terror into something more bearable, almost into relationship. Morozov's journey, from that first casual notation, "Heard wolves in the far wood tonight," to his final entry, acknowledging them as neighbors rather than enemies, represents a kind of wisdom that remains valuable. Not because we need to apply it to wolves specifically, but because the pattern it reveals, of moving from fear through attention to understanding, applies to many situations where humans encounter the unknown or uncontrollable. As we settle deeper into rest now, as our breathing slows and the boundaries of consciousness begin to soften, perhaps we can carry with us a gentle appreciation for those who came before us, who endured what we no longer have to endure, who developed skills of patience and vigilance and accommodation that helped them survive circumstances that would challenge us greatly. They were not heroes in the traditional sense, not figures of dramatic action or decisive triumph. They were simply people doing what was necessary night after night, season after season, developing the quiet strength that comes from facing sustained difficulty without the option of escape. And perhaps we can also carry a quiet acknowledgement of the wolves themselves, those intelligent social animals that were eliminated from most of their historical range, not because they were truly a major threat to human survival, but because humans wanted landscapes simplified, wanted the comfort of spaces thoroughly controlled, wanted night to be empty rather than inhabited. The wolves were doing what wolves do, living in their territory, hunting their prey, raising their young, using vocalizations to maintain pack cohesion and communicate across distances. That this brought them into conflict with human expansion was not really their choice or their fault, but they paid the price nonetheless, became casualties of a transformation they could not understand or resist. There is a kind of sadness in this, a recognition that our comfort was built on their elimination, that the quiet nights we now enjoy came at the cost of silencing voices that had echoed through winter darkness for millennia before humans arrived with their axes and their ambitions and their need to make the land conform to their plans. We cannot undo this transformation, cannot bring back the world as it was before frontier expansion reshaped the landscape, but we can remember it, can hold some awareness of what was lost alongside our appreciation for what was gained, can let that awareness inform how we think about the wild spaces and wild creatures that still exist at the margins of our thoroughly domesticated world. Let the darkness around you now feel peaceful rather than threatening. Let your breathing deepen and slow. You are safe here, in this moment, in this place where wolves are distant memories rather than immediate presences, where night is gentle and controllable, where sleep can come without vigilance. The struggles we have explored together tonight are over. The frontier winters have passed into history. The wolves have retreated or been eliminated, their howling replaced by silence or by the ambient sounds of human civilization that fill the spaces where wildness once existed. Morozov is long dead, his journal entries preserved as historical documents rather than lived experience. The wealthy landowners who experienced winter from comfortable distance have also passed, their stone houses either crumbled or repurposed, their perspectives recorded in letters that scholars now study to understand social dynamics of frontier expansion. The actual experience, the sound of wolves howling outside cabin walls, the quality of fear that made sleep difficult, the long nights of listening and waiting, exists now only in memory and imagination in our attempts to reach back across time and feel what they felt. But this act of imagination, this gentle exploration we have undertaken together, serves a purpose even as it helps you drift towards sleep. It reminds us that history is not just about events and dates and political developments, but about how it felt to be alive in particular times and places, about the daily texture of existence, about how ordinary people managed extraordinary circumstances through patience and adaptation rather than heroism or drama. It connects us to human experiences that seem distant but share fundamental similarities with our own lives: the need to manage fear, to maintain hope through difficult seasons, to find ways to coexist with things we cannot control or fully understand. As sleep approaches, let these thoughts settle gently into the background. Let the images fade: the cabin in winter darkness, the wolves at the clearing's edge, Morozov at his door listening to the night, the comfortable rooms of wealthy houses where winter felt different, all the varied experiences of those long-ago winters when humans and wolves negotiated their shared territory through sound and distance and mutual wariness. Let them become like dreams, present but not demanding, interesting but not urgent, part of the peaceful drift toward unconsciousness. The history we have explored tonight is done. Its lessons have been absorbed, its stories told, its mysteries acknowledged. Now there is only rest, only the gentle surrender to sleep that comes when the mind has been occupied with something engaging enough to quiet anxious thoughts, but calm enough not to stimulate or disturb. You have traveled far tonight, back through centuries, into experiences quite different from your own, and now you are returning, coming back to your present moment, your warm bed, your quiet room. The journey has been long and slow and deliberately paced to help you arrive at this point, relaxed, peaceful, ready to let consciousness fade into sleep. The wolves that troubled Morozov will not trouble you. The darkness that surrounded frontier cabins does not surround you now. The vigilance that was necessary then is not necessary here. You can sleep deeply, completely, without listening for sounds in the night, without measuring safety in terms of barred doors and distance to tree lines. The world has changed, has become in many ways safer and more comfortable, and you are a beneficiary of that transformation. Sleep is yours to claim. Rest is available without cost or condition. The night around you is empty of threats, full only of quietness and the possibility of dreams. Let yourself sink into that quietness now. Let the weight of your body settle into the mattress. Let your muscles release their subtle tensions. Let your breathing become automatic and effortless. Let your thoughts scatter and dissolve like morning fog under rising sun. There is nothing you need to do, nowhere you need to be, no vigilance required. Just rest, just peace, just the slow, gentle descent into sleep that comes when the mind finally stops working and allows the body to take over, to follow its natural rhythms toward unconsciousness and renewal. The stories we have shared tonight will be there when you wake if you want them, but for now they can fade, can become part of the general background of memory rather than active thought. The frontier is gone, the wolves are silent, the winter nights have passed, and you are here, safe and warm, ready for sleep. Let it come. Let the last threads of awareness loosen and drift apart. Let the final thoughts fade into nothing. The night is yours and it is peaceful, and you can rest now deeply and completely until morning comes and calls you back to waking life. But that is hours away still, and for now there is only this: the comfort of your bed, the quietness of your room, the gentle certainty that you are safe and can sleep without fear, without listening, without the need to maintain any awareness at all. Sleep well, sleep deeply. Let the history we have explored together become a gentle backdrop to your dreams, a reminder that you live in easier times, that the struggles of the past have given way to the relative peace of the present, that you have been given gifts your ancestors worked hard to provide: safety, comfort, The ability to sleep through winter nights without counting the hours until dawn. Accept these gifts now. Embrace the rest that is available to you. Let yourself drift away from consciousness, away from thought, away from everything except the simple, animal process of sleep, the restoration that happens when we finally stop trying to control or understand and simply let ourselves be carried into darkness that holds no threats, only the promise of morning and the renewal that sleep provides. The wolves are gone. The winter has passed. The frontier exists only in memory and history, and you are here now, in this moment of transition between waking and sleeping, between awareness and dreams, between the stories we have shared and the rest that awaits. Let go now. Let sleep take you. The night is yours, and it is peaceful, and you are safe. Rest well, gentle traveler through history. Rest well and let the quiet darkness hold you softly until light returns.